Welcome, I'm Cynthia Nims, and this is French Home Cooking, The Essential Techniques. And this is French custard ice cream. It's a simple and delicious example of a core French technique that you're going to learn in these lessons, and something that you're going to be able to take into the kitchen, become really familiar with, and have a lot of fun with too. Get a little creative. All of these lessons, you're going to learn base techniques that are going to serve you very well in many, many ways. For instance, this ice cream, I could have infused the base with some coffee beans and added some real distinct flavor to the ice cream. I could have perhaps added some toasted hazelnuts at the end for a little distinctive crunch, or it could be as simple as adding some fresh seasonal berries. It's really delicious as is. It's a wonderful core recipe, and you can embellish it any way you like. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. It's not quite time for dessert yet. First, we're going to explore some lessons that take you through some traditional French savory dishes. For this class, I've chosen a range of recipes from savory to sweet and rustic to more refined as a way of exploring how the building blocks of French cooking, the core techniques, can come together to help you create wonderful and simple dishes in your own kitchen. We're going to construct a vinaigrette dressing. I'll talk to you about choosing different oils and vinegars to work with, how to prepare that simple emulsion, and I'll talk to you a little bit about different lettuces you can use for a salade verte or a green salad. For a classic cheese souffle, we start with making a bechamel sauce, which is a really core technique in France. I'll show you also how to fold ingredients together. For the rustic fish chowder, we're going to start with a core technique of making a basic fish stock. I'll talk to you about how to work with fish fillets, and I will also show you one way to lightly thicken a chowder of this nature. Roast chicken, poulet rôti, is one of the classic French dishes. It's got a number of easy ways to add aromatic elements, which I'll show you, and I'll give you some tips to get the best results from roasting a whole chicken. Then there's this quintessential French beef stew. I'll talk with you about the right beef to choose to work with. I'll give you some ideas for varying the recipe, and we'll use a different thickening technique here, beurre manier, to add some rich elegance to the stew. We'll talk about a couple of ways that the French work with potatoes. We'll do a potato gratin and a puree of potatoes. I'll talk to you about how to pick the best potato for each use, some seasoning variations, and some tips for the best tools to help you get the best results. And of course, that ice cream. We're going to discuss how to make a crème anglaise, or that custard base that serves as a foundation. I'll show you how to work with whole vanilla beans, and I'm also going to give you some tips to make sure you get the best results out of the finished product. I think of cooking and music as actually having something in common. In music, before you can improvise, you really need to know some core techniques. You need to learn about scales and time signatures and chord progressions, but once you have that basic foundation down, you're free to improvise and be creative, and it's just like that in the kitchen. You're going to learn core techniques from which you can then improvise yourself. Another way I look at it is as building blocks. Each of these dishes that you're going to see, the recipes I'm going to walk through, they all provide individual building blocks that you can use in those recipes certainly, but you can also take them and apply them to other dishes, other ingredients, and you can go from there and be creative and have fun in the kitchen. Why are you joining me for this class? It might be because you have a distinct love of food and you want to learn some ways that you can share that love of food with your family and friends. Or maybe it's because you've taken a trip or two to France and you've experienced some of these dishes there and you want to learn a little bit more about how you can recreate them at home. Either way, I really hope you're going to enjoy French cooking at home, the essential techniques. Okay, so we're going to get started with our first techniques. They include making a vinaigrette dressing. We're going to discuss different lettuces and how to clean and work with them. And I'm also going to give you some really fun variation ideas for working with vinaigrette. Different ways you can make the vinaigrette to begin with and different ways to use it as well. Olive oil and red wine vinegar are the two most classic ingredients that are used for vinaigrette dressing. And for a little rich flavor variation, it's nice to use a nut oil. This is a hazelnut oil. There are a variety of nut oils that are available as well. They are really, really delicious in vinaigrettes as variations on the theme. And there are also a number of vinegars that you can use in place of the red wine if you prefer. Tarragon vinegar is a really delicious herb vinegar. Champagne vinegar has a little more finesse than a traditional. There's white wine vinegar, champagne vinegar. There's a lot of different wine type vinegars. And then there are some fruit-flavored vinegars. This is a raspberry. You might see blueberry, fig vinegars. There's all sorts of vinegars to play around with, which makes it really fun. So once you learn this base recipe, you're going to find that it's really easy to make variations and change it up during the week. So to get started, vinaigrette really could not be much easier. It's a simple proportion of 1 part vinegar and 3 parts oil. In this case, I do have the red wine and the extra virgin olive oil. I always like to put a little Dijon mustard in the vinaigrette, not only to give that nice, distinct peppery mustard flavor, but it helps with the emulsion, which I'll talk about in a minute. So first, the vinegar, a little pinch of salt, and I'm going to go ahead and put the mustard in. And I'm going to stir this up a little bit. Ideally, let it sit for 30 seconds or a minute. Allow the salt to dissolve. So now that the salt's dissolved, I can go ahead and drizzle in the olive oil. And you'll see it starts to thicken up a little bit. This is a light emulsion. When we think of emulsions, we often think of them as being quite thick, like a mayonnaise. This is a lighter version, but it still does thicken the combination of that oil and vinegar nicely, especially again having that little dose of mustard in the dressing as well. So there we see the oil's pretty well integrated. We've got a nice sort of silky texture. That is a beautiful classic base. I'm going to take a moment and put in just a dose of freshly ground pepper. And see how hard that was? Classic, wonderful vinaigrette dressing, the true French dressing. And from this point, you have plenty of room to make embellishments. I already spoke with you a little bit about some of the oils and vinegars that you could use. You could add some diced some diced toasted nuts, some minced fresh herbs would be great, crumbled cheese. There's a lot of ways you can vary this dressing before you use it. And there's also a lot of ways that you could use vinaigrette dressing in other types of recipes beyond even just a traditional green salad. I love to cook up lentils and stir the vinaigrette into the lentils. You have a lovely quick lentil salad. You can do a super quick sort of almost pickle of sorts, quick pickled vegetables. If you put some slices of sort of radish and cucumber in here, set it aside for a little bit, you have sort of an essence of a pickle without having to go through a more traditional pickling process. It's just a nice little sort of piquant flavor. You can poach some leeks and use this as a dressing on poached leeks. There's a lot of ways you can go. But that was an incredibly quick recipe, very simple. 3 parts oil, 1 part vinegar, a little salt and pepper, dash of mustard. How can you go wrong? So now that I'm done with the vinaigrette, I'm going to go ahead and move on and talk about the lettuces. When it comes to making a green salad, of course, there are a whole range of lettuces that you can possibly use. This is a classic simple butter lettuce. This is a type of chicory. It's got very fluted little edges. It's really a pretty salad lettuce. Up front, we have a type of hydroponic lettuce that is a butter lettuce. And here is a classic red leaf lettuce. There's also arugula, which is a really delicious green to use in salads. Mâche, or lamb's lettuce, is one that's very popular in France. There's a whole range of lettuces. It really doesn't matter as much what type of lettuce you use, just something that looks good at the market, that's seasonal, that you want to use in your own personal salad. I also love to make salad with Belgian endive. And I'm not sure if you know exactly how to prepare Belgian endive, so I'm going to go ahead and take a moment to show you how I trim and slice endive, and they're going to actually go into our salad. So these are the Belgian type of endive, which are quite different little greens than the head lettuce that we usually work with. So I'm just going to show you really quickly how I like to prepare them. First off, cut the end off the base. If you find that your head of endive has any miscolored or oversized or broken leaves on the outside, you can peel them away a little bit, but it's not always necessary. And then the core of endive you want to cut out. It can be a little bit bitter, so it's important to take this little step before you slice the endive for a salad. So I cut the endive lengthwise, and then you'll see the difference between these leaves, which are the delicious part, and then this core here going down the center can be a little bit bitter sometimes. So I just use the tip of my knife to cut out that core, leaving just the tender, crisp leaves. The interesting thing is you never know until you cut into an endive quite how much core it's going to have. Sometimes you might cut into one and there's just a very little bit at the base. Sometimes it can be larger. So I'm going to just repeat that. Again, cutting the endive head lengthwise. This one's got a little bit shorter core. Actually, I should be pronouncing this endive if I was being very, very accurate. Either way you pronounce it, it's really a delicious green. Not only in salads and used fresh, but I love to braise endive as well. So now it's just a simple matter of cutting across the halves into slices. I find it easier to do if it's turned back upside down so that the cut side's down, a little bit easier to manage. And endive does discolor after it's been cut. The white does sort of turn brown a little bit, so it's best to do this shortly before you're going to use the endive. So there we go. Beautiful fresh endive. And now I've got nothing more than to combine my lettuces in my salad bowl. I'll show you how I like to toss the lettuce and make sure it's well blended. And that's as easy as salade verte is with a homemade vinaigrette dressing. This might look like an oversized bowl, but in honesty, you want to be sure and you want to be sure and have a large enough bowl so that when you do toss the lettuces, you have plenty of room. There's nothing worse than having a little bit too little room and you don't really then get the dressing well distributed on the lettuces. So go ahead and have a big sized bowl. I'm going to put my endive directly in there. And then this is lettuce that's already been cleaned. I like to just fill my sink with water and put the heads of lettuce, or the leaves of lettuce, separated leaves in the sink, swish it around with my hands briefly, and then I have a salad spinner at home that I really love to use. You want to get as much moisture off as you can. Some of the smaller leaves are delightful to just put in as is. Otherwise, larger leaves I just tear roughly. If the core is getting a little bit tough, or the stem I should say, going down the middle of the lettuce, you may want to take that out. Sometimes green salads, in fact often green salads in France, use nothing but lettuce. That's the classic salade verte. I think in the United States and other parts of the world sometimes salads are often have quite a lot of different ingredients. You know, sliced carrots, cherry tomatoes, croutons, all that fun stuff. But in France, when you order a salad, a classic traditional salad, it is going to very often be nothing but lettuce. So it really gives a chance for the lettuces to shine and be a prime ingredient. And it's just a showcase for a beautiful vinaigrette dressing and wonderful seasonal lettuces. And again, you could be using arugula, you can mix a whole range of different lettuces, or you can just showcase something, one single variety. Some of these cores, again, I'm taking off simply because they're a little tough. So there we go, all my lettuces are all together. And here's my vinaigrette. See, the emulsion has actually held together pretty well. Sometimes it may separate on sitting, just even for 5 or 10 minutes. You might see that the oil and vinegars have separated a little bit, and that's not a problem at all. Just take your whisk or a fork and blend them back together. It will re-emulsify very easily. And I think one of the things to remember with salads, particularly when you're dressing salads, is there's It's better to add only part of the dressing and add a little bit more later if needed, because if you use too much dressing and the salad is sort of soppy with vinaigrette, there's no way to really fix that. So always just put in maybe part, half, or 2/3 of the dressing first, toss that, see how well it's distributed and if the lettuce is lightly but evenly coated. And then you can always add more, but it's really, really hard to take away some of that vinaigrette if you have used too much. So again, a nice big bowl. This is a great salad bowl because it's broad and not tall, so it's very, very easy to employ that action of just literally tossing the salad. In France, this is called, they say, I'm going to fatiguer la salade, which is to fatigue or sort of work it out, make it work hard. So we're tossing it, working it, fatiguing it. And you can see, I hope that the lettuce leaves are lightly but evenly coated. They're glistening, and we're not seeing big pools of vinaigrette in the bottom of the bowl, so that's a great sign. So I may not use that last bit, which is fine because vinaigrette holds really well. Just get yourself a little jar, put that in the fridge. You can add to it later. You can use it again. You can use it on that lentil salad or do any number of different things with the vinaigrette. But again, it's better to use less than you need and add more than it is to use all of it and find that you've dressed it too much. So there you go. You've learned how to make a classic vinaigrette dressing, a very, very simple salade verte, and this is a great beginning to any French meal. In the next lesson, we're going to learn even more important techniques for French home cooking. For the cheese soufflé, it's going to start with a technique to make a bechamel sauce. Next, it's going to be working with eggs, which is particularly important with soufflé. And last but not least, folding 2 different ingredients together, which makes a light and fluffy soufflé. So I will see you soon for the next lesson. Welcome back to French Home Cooking, The Essential Techniques. I'm Cynthia Nims. For this next lesson, we're going to be looking at soufflé au fromage, one of the most traditional of all French dishes. I think everybody has heard of soufflé au fromage. This is cheese soufflé, a really classic technique. It's a base recipe from which you're going to be able to do a load of variations. It's just a lot of fun. It's a little intimidating, at least it seems intimidating, but I think after this lesson you're going to find out it's a lot easier than you probably thought. And I'm going to show you exactly what it takes to make a great cheese soufflé. You're going to learn how to work with eggs. I'll talk a little bit about some of the techniques for beating eggs and how to use them. I'm going to talk about how to fold the ingredients together. That's one of the most important techniques, is folding those whipped egg whites. And one of the most important foundation techniques you're going to learn in this lesson is that of a bechamel sauce. It serves as the base of this and many savory soufflés. It's a really classic, simple white sauce that has a great many uses in French cuisine. Today, it serves as the base for our cheese soufflé. And it starts out very easily. I am going to first take some milk and warm it up a little bit. I don't want to add it cold to the sauce later. So I'm just going to put it in a pan and put it on low heat to warm gently. And while that's warming, I'm going to go ahead and get started in my saucepan with butter and flour, which serve as the base of this sauce. First step is to go ahead and put the butter in the pan. I want to melt that before I add the flour. It's great to choose a pan that has a nice heavy base because you want to be sure that this sauce cooks evenly and that you don't get any brown spots and that it'll thicken evenly as well later. So try to find a pan that has a good solid base and solid sides for even distribution of that heat. So now that the butter's melted, I'm going to go ahead and add the flour all at once, directly in the pan. And just use the whisk to blend it in evenly and quickly. It's really important to use a whisk when you're making a bechamel sauce rather than a wooden spoon, because you want to be able to actively blend the butter and flour and make sure that they're not sticking to the sides of the pan and that the flour is getting evenly distributed. It's a lot harder to do that with just a wooden spoon. So you'll see it's starting to bubble a little bit. The cooking process here really is just a matter of a couple of minutes. You want the flour to cook a little bit. If you just proceeded directly with this sauce, it would have a little bit of an actual floury flavor, and you want to avoid that by cooking it first in the butter a little bit. This is what I like to see, that it's sort of bubbling evenly over across the bottom of the pan. I'm just going to give it about another minute of this gentle bubble. You don't want it really to brown. You want this to remain a nice white sauce. So it's just gentle. Do keep stirring though. And I like to be sure I actually get into those edges and not just drawing across the middle of the center of the pan, but get that end of the whisk into the edges of the pan, because that can be the problem where there really can be some sticking. And then when the flour's cooked for a minute or so, I like to turn the heat off because I really don't want to overcook it at this point. And then I'm going to slowly incorporate that warm milk. It's whole milk. There's really no reason to use, it's already a pretty rich sauce. There's really no reason to use half and half, although you certainly could if you want. Cream would probably be a little bit too much here, so I really just like to use whole milk. So the milk has started to steam a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and just slowly pour that in, whisking well to blend. And with the milk incorporated, I'll go ahead and turn the heat back on. Like I said, that's just a little bit of assurance to make sure I don't overcook that flour and butter mixture. And it's already starting to thicken. I'm not sure if you can see that quite yet. But the milk now cooking with that butter and flour mixture is creating the very most basic and simple of white sauces. But it sounds so much nicer in French, doesn't it? Bechamel sauce. So you can see it's getting thicker. This sauce base that we use for a souffle is a little thicker than you might use for another kind of a recipe where bechamel is used. It's very, very simple to amend the final texture of the sauce by simply using more liquid. You can use the same amount of flour and butter to start with and just add more of the milk to achieve the texture and the thickness that you really are looking for. So you can see how much thicker that is now. That's looking really good. I'm going to go ahead and turn the heat off because, again, I don't want to risk overcooking it, and be really, really sure to evenly scrape across the bottom and into the corners of the pan. That's got a really nice thick consistency. Bechamel is an incredible base for a lot of dishes. You can use it in pasta dishes. You can use it in gratin with like endive and ham with a bechamel sauce and some cheese is a really, really classic sort of rustic bistro dish. Really lots of uses. And again, to sort of avoid overcooking, I'm not going to leave it in the pan any longer than necessary. Now that it's thick like this, I'm going to go ahead and transfer it to a bowl. If I were to step away and take a phone call or go get the mail before I transferred it to a bowl, I might come back and find that it had sort of stuck to the bottom of the pan and maybe browned in the corners or something, and I want to avoid that. So here again, a super simple, basic white sauce. I'm going to season it with a little bit of salt and some pepper. If you have white pepper on hand, you can certainly use that. Some people like to use white pepper in white sauces just to avoid there being any specks, but by the time this souffle is cooked and the cheese is in there and all that other delicious stuff is going on, the little pepper specks aren't going to be an issue. I like to let that cool just a little bit. There's really easy ways to make variations on this really basic sauce. When I add cheese, it becomes what's known as a Mornay sauce. That's a classic bechamel cheese sauce. If you add cooked onions that you've pureed first, add them to this bechamel base, it becomes what's known as a Soubise sauce. You can add curry powder. You can add any number of your favorite seasonings. It could be chili pepper if you like. Really super great foundation recipe to have on hand. And how easy was it? It's cooled a teeny bit, so now I'm going to add the most important part of our cheese souffle is really good cheese. This is Gruyere cheese, which is a firm aged cheese that has a lot of nutty flavor. It's really delicious. It's a good time to splurge on a really nice cheese when you're doing a cheese souffle of this kind. So I'm going to go ahead and add the grated cheese. To be perfectly honest, this cheese souffle is awesome with good sharp cheddar cheese too. It doesn't even have to be a French cheese. But just choose a good cheese that's got really good flavor, a lot of nutty character. So there we go. This is going to be the base of our souffle. I know it kind of looks like I put this in an extra large bowl that might be too big, but I want to have plenty of room later when I add the beaten egg whites and fold them in. I don't want to feel like I'm in a cramped bowl that's too small. So this large bowl is going to give me plenty of room to do that important folding technique and make sure that the egg whites are fully and well incorporated. This is a little too warm right now for me to add the egg whites, so I'm going to let it sit aside for a little bit until it's closer to room temperature. So in the bowl here is that bechamel sauce we just made. That delicious Gruyere cheese has been stirred in and now it's had a chance to cool. So I'm ready to proceed with the souffle. But before I beat the egg whites and get to that part, I wanted to take a second and talk with you about the egg itself. Because with souffle in particular, anytime you're beating an egg white and you need to get that volume, it's particularly important to carefully crack the egg so you're sure to get just the whites. If you had even a little speck of yolk in the egg whites, it can actually impede the egg beating and it will keep it from getting the volume that you might otherwise. So I'm just going to show you how I prefer to crack my egg. For one thing, I think a lot of us learned early on to crack eggs against the side of a bowl to split the halves. But I find that it kind of creates shards that are too small, and sometimes you can get those little bits of egg shell in the egg when you go to separate it. So I think that's just not the best way to go. What I like to do is take the egg and simply crack it on the counter, split it open, and then just carefully, try to be really careful here when you transfer from one to the other. Allow the egg to tip a little bit, that extra white to come out. Back and forth once or twice, and then you've got a beautiful yolk that's separate and a white that has not a speck of either shell or yolk in it. But I've already separated my eggs that I'm going to be using for the souffle. So here I have my whites, which means I have a lot of yolks to make that delicious ice cream that we sampled earlier on. Whites go into the mixer. I'm going to turn it on to a relatively high speed, and I'll show you in a few moments the perfect volume. You want it to be fluffy but not too stiff. So I think these are pretty good. I'm going to check the texture. They're a little bit soft. I'm going to give them another moment. I want them to have enough structure to hold their shape, but I don't want them to be so stiff that they're not going to blend in really well with the bechamel. Okay, I think this is going to be good. They hold a nice peak, which is great. They're still smooth and glossy and supple. And just by contrast, so you can see the difference, these are egg whites that I overbeat a little bit earlier. They're quite stiff, they even go a little bit grainy, and they really would not blend in well with the bechamel, and they really wouldn't create the light, puffy structure that you're looking for in a souffle. So first, I'm going to take just a little bit of the egg white, maybe a quarter or so, add it to the bechamel. And even though in a moment, I'm going to show how important folding is in terms of a delicate procedure, at the beginning, it doesn't have to be quite so delicate because what you're doing is lightening up that bechamel sauce, that souffle base, so that the rest of the fluffy, light egg whites are going to blend in better. So you can already see that it's becoming fluffier and lighter, which is a great start. And now I've got a lighter mixture that's going to be easier to more evenly blend with the rest of these egg whites. Still don't want to add all of these though. I'm going to do this in a couple more batches. And here's where the folding technique really sort of starts to matter more. What you're trying to do is cut through the egg whites and in small doses sort of incorporate that into the bechamel base. So what I do is I sort of cut into the middle, turn over a little bit, and at the same time as I'm turning my spatula, I turn the bowl a little bit. So you're sort of doing two motions at once. Turning the spatula, lifting it up under the mixture, cutting through some of those egg whites, and then at the same time turning the bowl so you're sure that you're really working evenly around the whole of the contents of the bowl. And I like to work in the middle of the mixture. Sometimes it seems like a natural movement to just sort of work the spatula around the outside edge of the souffle, or I'm sorry, of the mixture, but then you're really missing the center and you're maybe not getting as even a distribution as you really want. So you can see with each turn, the mixture is becoming more cohesive. I'm going to go ahead and add the last of the eggs. Just keep with this movement, turning. Again, both the spatula and the bowl to get an even distribution. And you see how light and fluffy this all is. It's not the end of the world if you have little bits of white that aren't absolutely and thoroughly blended in. You want to do your best to get them evenly distributed, but you also don't want to do this for 10 minutes and worry too much about getting it absolutely precise because you want to take advantage of that lightness of the egg whites. So I'm going to go ahead and transfer this mixture into my very well buttered souffle dish. So now I'm smoothing the top a little bit. Don't overdo working it, but just want to make sure it's relatively even on top. And now I'm going to pop it into my preheated oven. So here we go. Nice, brown, puffed up, golden. In fact, puff is pretty much what souffle means. It's about being light and airy and puffy. So you've got to have your guests at the table already when the souffle comes out of the oven. It starts to deflate, but you want to be sure they're ready, so you serve it up, get it out there while it's good and hot. There's a lot of ways, now that you know this basic French technique of making a souffle, there are a lot of variations that are really easy to do. One is as simple as just making it in an individual souffle dish, a little ramekin. You can also make a spinach souffle, You can make a crab souffle. Both of those cases you want to have the food pre-cooked, the spinach and the crab cooked, finely diced, and nice and dry, so when you add them to the souffle mixture, they're not going to weigh down the souffle. You're going to get that light puffiness. You can also make a curry souffle, just simply adding curry powder to the bechamel base. So there you have it. See, it's already sort of losing its poof, which is why it's so delightful. It's just an ethereal, beautiful thing to enjoy as soon as it comes out of the oven. In the next lesson, the attention's going to turn to fish chowder, a really simple, delightful base recipe. You're going to learn really important techniques that include fish stock, how to make that foundational recipe, fish fillets, how to work with them, particularly how to remove their skin, and thickening techniques, one of many options that's particularly good for a chowder of this nature. I will see you soon for the next lesson. Welcome back to French Home Cooking, The Essential Techniques. I'm Cynthia Nims. And in this lesson, we're going to be taking a look at the French fish chowder. There's a lot of ways you can approach this recipe. I'm going to take you through a standard preparation that is going to include some great techniques that you're going to be able to use many, many different ways. One of them is going to be some basics about working with fish fillets. Another is going to be talking about easy variations. This is a very lightly thickened chowder. I'll talk about some other ways you can prepare chowders, other ingredients you can use. And one of the most important key lessons here is going to be the technique of making fish stock. That is the base of a really great fish chowder. And it's a technique that you're going to be able to use and apply to a wide range of recipes. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with my fish chowder. First step being the stock. You may have made different types of stock in the past, some of them chicken stock, some of them beef stock. Fish stock is pretty much made in the same way. The one simple thing to keep in mind is fish stock cooks very quickly. You don't need to simmer it for 2 or 3 hours. In fact, you don't want to simmer it for 2 or 3 hours. It's a very quick technique. You just want to simmer the bones and the aromatic vegetables for about 20 minutes. So that's a real benefit. It's really nice to know how quick this is to make. I think one of the hardest parts about making fish stock at home is basically finding the fish bones. It's not as easy as it used to be to find fish bones in your store. So you may need to plan ahead. Call a fish market near you. You may need to order them in advance, find out that they only cut their fish on Wednesdays or something. So it may take a little bit of time. Plan ahead for that. These are beautiful halibut bones that we just picked up here today. Some of the other ingredients are going to be some onion and celery for light aromatic flavor. Again, thyme, which shows up in so many classic French preparations, fresh bay leaf, and a little bit of black peppercorn. You'll see these vegetables are cut up in relatively small pieces. Again, that's because this fish stock is going to cook pretty quickly. If this were, again, one of those beef or chicken stocks that cooks longer, you can have much larger pieces of your vegetables because they're going to have plenty of time to simmer and draw off all that flavor. But for a quick cooking, as little as 20 minutes, having smaller pieces of these vegetables is very beneficial. So first thing, I'm just going to go ahead and put the halibut bones in my stock pot. Again, a heavy stock pot is great because you want to be able to manage that heat, hold the heat, distribute it evenly. And then my onion, celery, whoops, peppercorns are going in a little early, thyme sprigs, my black peppercorns, and a fresh bay leaf. You can certainly use a dried bay leaf if you're not able to get fresh. You may notice I haven't put any salt in it, and I'm not going to. When you're making a stock, even again those beef and chicken stocks, it's not uncommon to use no salt at all, because what you're really doing here is pulling the essential flavors off of the bones and the vegetables, and you often just aren't quite sure how you're going to use it later. Sometimes you make stock in advance, you have it in the freezer, and later you may be adding it to either a recipe that already has a salty character, or you may be reducing the stock and using it in a way which would become too strongly flavored. If you have a salty stock to begin with and you reduce it, you're going to have an overpowering salty flavor, and that can be a detriment. So if you don't put any salt in, at least you know you have full control over the final result when you use the stock later. So it's just a nice habit to get into, not using any salt when you actually make the stock. Pour in some cold water. Don't be tempted to start with hot water thinking you're getting a jump on things, because the hot water in contact with those bones right away is going to pull off more impurities and just make the stock a little cloudier. If you start with cold water and all the ingredients are heating up together and the bones are sort of gently cooking, then you're going to have more control over sort of the clarity and the ultimate flavor of the stock. So do start with cold water. So now it's just a matter of putting it over high heat. I'm going to let it come to a full boil, and then I'm going to turn it down right away to a medium-low so that it's at a simmer. I don't want to boil this too strongly because then the bones are going to draw off some of their bitter flavor, and you get a cloudier stock when that happens. So again, bring to a boil, reduce it to medium-low, let it simmer gently, and from the point that it boils, that's when you count your 20 minutes. So we'll be back in a little bit when this has had its simmer time. So the stock has been simmering for 20 minutes. That again is 20 minutes that you count from the time that it comes to a boil. And you saw that I then reduced the temperature so it was at a low simmer. We don't want it to boil too fast while the stock is cooking. So now you'll see that the scum is no longer on the surface of this stock. It's really important as a technique when you're making fish stock and other stocks too, to skim away that scum, which is actually a formal culinary term that refers to the proteins that are given off by the bones and the meat when it's simmering. It's a little bit of an off flavor sometimes, and it also contributes to cloudiness. So removing that, as you saw me do as it simmered, just helps create the best possible stock in the long run when you're done. So now I'm ready to go ahead and strain the stock, and we'll be ready to go with our chowder. This can be a little messy sometimes because those fish bones are in pretty big chunks. Sure smells good though. So I'm just going to lift off the strainer. Then I'm going to go ahead and let the stock sit, cool a little bit. It's not so much a matter of the cooling, but some of whatever little solids are still left in that stock, they're going to settle to the bottom, and we'll be able to pour off the clearest part of the stock when we proceed with the chowder, which is up next. So we've got that beautiful fish stock we just made. It's been strained and it's here ready to go, which means now it's time to get to the meat of the chowder, which in this case is fish. So I've got this beautiful halibut fillet. Some of it I've already cubed up, but I wanted to save a little piece and show you how to remove the skin from a fillet of fish. Oftentimes you'll find most fish probably has the skin removed, but just in case, I want to show you this quick little technique because it's something that you might need to use now and again. So again, this is a nice piece of halibut fillet. It's got its skin still on. And the trick is to have it then skin side down on the chopping board. And preferably you want the tapered, if you've got a tail end, this is really the easiest way to work on a fish fillet, is to start from the smaller tapered tail end. What I do first is to cut down a little bit into the flesh, just to the point that you're starting to feel the base. You don't want to go through the skin, but you want to get just to the skin. But just as I get to the skin, I turn the blade of the knife and I go parallel to the board, and I just gently slide the knife back and forth. And you use this little tail end here that you've got some flesh attached to. Hold onto that with your other hand, and it helps hold that skin firm. And you just run the blade of your knife between the two. If you need to slide it back in there a little bit, I think some of that's still attached. There we go. So you've got fillet and you've got skin. Now for this particular recipe for the chowder, I wanted fish pieces that are about 1-inch cubes. So that means that I'm just going to cut lengthwise pieces about 1 inch thick. You don't have to be absolutely perfect. It's invariable that you're going to have some pieces that are a little bit more slender. And then just cut across into 1-inch cubes, more or less. You don't want to have the pieces too small because as the fish cooks, it tends to start falling apart. So that's why I don't like to cut the fish into tiny little cubes. So there we go. I'll have my halibut ready to go into the chowder. This goes in really at the very end of cooking because it doesn't take long to cook at this point. Now I'll get back to the other ingredients for the chowder. As with many soups, you start with some aromatic vegetables. We're going to have a little bit of herb action and some potatoes. It's a little bit of white wine, adds some character. I've got the carrots already chopped. I've got some waxy sort of yellowfin type, Yukon Gold type potatoes. I wasn't sure if everybody was familiar with working with a leek though, so I did want to go ahead and show you how I like to approach preparing a leek. First is to certainly cut off this scraggly root end. And then this top part is very pretty and green, but it gets really tough. So what I tend to do is cut the leek at the part where I start seeing the lighter green begins to turn darker green. It's usually also where these leaves start separating out. So let's cut it off there. And then these separated layers can often harbor little bits of dirt and debris. So it's pretty important to clean the leek before you continue. What I do is split the leek lengthwise. And it tends to be more an issue up here towards the darker part of the leek. This one doesn't look too bad, but there are a lot of times when you're going to open these layers and see grit and dirt. You know, obviously you don't want to put that in your dish. So what I do is simply run this part under the water in the sink just to wash out any grit, get it nice and dry. That's what I did to this half that was a little grittier earlier, so it's all ready to go. And then for this particular recipe, I want the leek sliced, so I'm just going to cut across it. So there you go. Leek is being used in place of just regular white or yellow onion, which is often used in a lot of soups. But I love the flavor of leek. It's part of the onion family, so it's got a familiar oniony flavor. It's just a little bit sweeter, a little bit more delicate, and I find it a little more savory. So we're going to go ahead and dive into cooking this vegetable base to start the chowder. Got some butter in my heavy soup pot. So I'm going to melt that up. It might seem like a lot of butter. A lot of butter. That's always a good thing though, right? In this case, the butter is not only being used to saute the vegetables, but it's going to contribute to the base. I'll be adding flour in a little bit, so the flour and butter together are going to contribute to sort of the base of thickening this chowder lightly. Turn my heat up to medium, melt the butter, and then really just all of these vegetables go in together. Carrots that have been peeled and chopped. And again, these Yukon Gold potatoes that have been diced, scrubbed and diced. I like to leave the potato skin on for this particular type of recipe. The skin of a waxy potato in particular is pretty thin, so it's not something that's going to be unpleasant later, and it actually does help sort of hold the potato together as it cooks. So you can hear that sizzling away a little bit. We're going to cook this until the vegetables begin to turn tender. You don't want them to brown too much because you don't want the color of the chowder to become brown. So if the heat seems to be a little bit too high, you can certainly turn it down partway through. But you do want them to start to become tender, and then we'll continue shortly with adding some white wine to add a little bit of acidic flavor, and we'll continue finishing with the chowder. So the vegetables have been simmering for 4 or 5 minutes now. You'll see that the leeks become a little bit tender. The carrots and potatoes still need to cook a little bit. They're going to simmer in the stock, but you do start to see the edge of the potato turn a little bit translucent. That's a bit of a clue that at least they're starting to get ready for the next stage of this cooking process. You just want to give the vegetables a head start a little bit with this first few minutes in the pan. Now I'm going to add the flour. This is going to serve as the thickener for this chowder. It's not going to be a super thick chowder, but it's going to have a light sort of thick texture, and that comes from adding this flour at this point. So I'm going to put it into the pan and immediately just stir it around. You want it to get evenly coating those vegetables. And again, this is where that extra bit of butter helps, because that fat is going to help distribute the flour and create sort of an even blend with the vegetables and an even base from which we're going to be able to thicken this, rather than having sort of globs of flour in there that don't distribute very well. Fat helps. So you can see that now the flour is pretty well distributed, evenly coating those vegetables. Now I'm going to add the wine. It's just a little bit. You can skip the wine if you like, but I do prefer to have a touch of that acidity in here. It helps add some bright flavor. Stir that around for a moment. If you give it a second to simmer before adding the stock, it cooks off some of that alcohol from the wine. Although it's going to simmer for a little while, so it's not too big an issue. But if you just wait a moment before you add the stock. This is our beautiful fish stock that we just made. If you're not able to find the fish bones and make the stock yourself at home, don't worry too much. Some shops, fancy gourmet markets, even some mail order companies make good fish stock available that you can purchase. In a pinch, you could have made the stock with some fish fillets. It's a good time to use a cheaper fillet, because really you're going to be drawing all of the great flavor off of the fish fillets, so you really aren't going to want to use them. Whoops! Stir gently, Cynthia. You're not going to really want to use the fillets after they've simmered if you use them for a stock, because all that delicious flavor that they had is now in the broth. Or to be perfectly honest, you could make a chowder like this with just water. We'll have a little bit less rich flavor, but it'll still be yummy. So I've got all the stock in there. I wanted to show, so as I'd mentioned when I strained the stock, when we finished the stock earlier, that there might be some solids that collect in the bottom of the bowl. And even though we put it through a fine strainer, it's just natural that there's going to be a little bit that collects at the bottom. So that's why I didn't pour everything out of this pitcher when I added it to the chowder. So you'll see here some of those solids that still remain in the bottom. So I've got my chowder now on the heat. I'm going to bring it just up to a boil. I don't want it to cook too quickly. So I'm going to bring it up to a boil. It's almost there already. And then at the point that it's boiling, I'll reduce it to a simmer. Put the lid on it, not completely covering. I want a little bit of a gap, and it'll simmer until the vegetables are tender. And then we'll add the fish shortly before we're ready to serve, because it really only cooks in a few minutes. So the vegetables have been simmering for about 15 minutes or so, simmering gently, which is lovely. I love to see just those few bubbles breaking the surface, not boiling too hard. And I hope you can see that the thickness is just gently thicker than it was with the stock. Again, this isn't going to be a super thick chowder like we're used to sometimes in the United States. In France, they tend to be a little bit lighter in texture. So now is a great time to add the halibut. Again, the halibut is going to cook pretty quickly, and we don't want it to cook so much that it starts falling apart. So it's important to save this step until about 5 minutes or so before you think you are ready to serve it. If you're going to make this ahead, in fact, I recommend you only take it to this stage, let it cool, refrigerate it, and then reheat it again just before you're ready to serve the chowder. So in goes the halibut in those 1 inch or so cubes. I don't want to stir too much, but I also don't want all those pieces to be stuck together and not cook evenly. So I stir just gently, make sure those pieces are evenly distributed in that hot broth. Set the lid askew again just a little bit, and this is really going to take probably just 3, 4, maybe 5 minutes, depends on how dense the particular fish is you're using and how large the pieces are. But what I'm looking for is the fish being no longer translucent in the middle, and I'll show you that in a minute. We just got a couple of minutes for this to simmer, and we'll be right back to check them. So the soup has been simmering now for just a few more minutes. I'm pretty sure that fish will be ready. I'm just going to check. So I'm going to lift up one of the cubes. Just cut into it. And I'm looking to see that it's mostly white and flaky through, not too translucent. Not too, translucent is pretty much what you're seeing when it's raw, and you can see now that it is opaque through and cooked. So that's just perfect. It's still juicy, still delicious, but cooked all the way through. So the next step, just to finish things off and give it a little certain French je ne sais quoi, is going to be enriching this chowder with a little bit of crème fraîche, which is a French style of soured cream. Sometimes crème fraîche can be really quite thick, and if you put a large sort of thick portion directly into the chowder, it's going to be hard to get it to distribute. So what I like to do first is sort of stir it around a little bit, gets it to lighten up and thin its texture some. And then spoon that in. It's really just going to take maybe not even a minute. This rich, thick cream is going to melt into that warm chowder. Give it not only a little bit of that creamy richness, but there is a slight tang to crème fraîche as well. So it adds to that little bit of complement to the rich chowder with a slight creamy tang at the end. So I'm just stirring gently. Want to avoid breaking up the fish too much. Now it really looks like a chowder, right? We've got that lovely creamy texture. Beautiful vegetables, tender. Smells really delightful. So now we're really good to go. Those are the last 2 steps, just putting that fish in a few minutes before the end, the cream literally right before the end, and then the chowder's going to be finished with some herbs. Technically, I could stir the herbs in right now and they'd be evenly distributed in the chowder, but for this particular presentation, I like the idea of serving the chowder into the bowl, and then just before you take this out to your guests, adding a pinch of the fresh herbs into the center of each dish. The later they go into the chowder, the fresh herb hitting that hot soup, it's just going to create a really fresh punch of herb character that's going to stand out more than if I had stirred it into the whole pot of chowder earlier. Gosh, doesn't that look good? So as I mentioned, a little pinch of herbs. Here we have flat leaf parsley, some chives, and some thyme. Right in the middle. Yeah, and that herb aroma comes right up off that bowl of chowder because it's hitting that warm soup, fresh flavor and aromatic oils from the herbs. It's just a beautiful marriage. Creamy fish chowder, French style. And from this point, I just want to make sure you understand how versatile this recipe can be. There's so many ways you can play around with other seafoods and even other vegetables. From the sea, certainly clam chowder is something we're all familiar with. Clams sometimes have a slight sweet flavor. They're just delicious, obviously, in chowder form. And even mussels. They tend to have a slightly stronger flavor, sometimes a little bit briny. They are delicious in this sort of creamy chowder base. And then there's also crab. Crab has a really rich, slightly sweet flavor that makes a really delicious chowder too. And salmon. I love salmon chowder. You could have even made the stock with salmon bones instead of halibut bones, so you have a whole sort of salmon motif going on with the chowder, which is, just one of many different delicious variations. You can use almost any firm fish. On the vegetable side, I love fennel bulb with fish in a lot of different preparations, in chowder in particular. You could use it just like you did the onion, chop it up, add it early on, and it's slightly sweet, slight anisey flavor is a beautiful complement to seafood. Then I also like sunchokes. They have a texture similar to the potato that we used, but they have a slightly nutty flavor that is a delicious complement to fish. You could use pearl onions instead of the leeks. You could use regular yellow sweet onions. There's many, many ways you could vary this foundation recipe. So I hope you'll be able to use all these techniques in a lot of different ways. And in the next lesson, I'm going to teach you techniques for one of the most quintessential of those French dishes, the classic poulet rôti, or roast chicken. I'm going to teach you how to work with a whole chicken. I'm going to teach you some simple ways to add aromatic flavor while it roasts. And then I'm going to show you how to make a simple, delicious, slightly rustic, but wonderful pan sauce that we're going to drizzle over the chicken just before serving. So I'll see you very soon for that next lesson. Welcome back. This is French Home Cooking, The Essential Techniques. I'm Cynthia Nims. So in this lesson, we're going to be focusing on that classic French roast chicken, or poulet rôti. It's one of the simplest ways to cook chicken, and I think it's one of the most delicious. You start with a whole bird, so we're going to learn a little bit about just working with a whole chicken in general. I'm going to talk to you about some of the aromatic herbs I like to use when I make this at home, which I do a couple times a month. And we're going to make a really simple pan sauce with the juices that are left in the pan after the chicken has been roasted. Now you might look at this chicken and think it looks a little bit funky. It's got a little bit of a brown coloration and it has a different skin than it usually looks like when it comes out of the package. And that's because I left this in the refrigerator overnight on a plate so it could dry out a little bit. One of the prime ways you can work to assure having a crisp skin in the end, which is one of the best things about a good roast chicken, is that you have a dry skin. When we take a chicken right out of the package, it's often pretty wet, and even if you pat it down with paper towels, it's still a rather wet skin, and it takes a long time for that crispness to be achieved. So by taking it out of the package the night before, leaving it on a plate in the refrigerator, I put some paper towel underneath just to catch those juices. Then it dries out, and you're starting with an advantage that's going to help you achieve an even crisper skin in the end. So this is a really simple fryer. You might see it called a fryer in the store, which is not an indication of how you're supposed to cook it. It's simply more of a size indication. So this is a bird that's about 4 pounds, great to serve 3 or 4 people. I like to use just fresh herbs from the garden. We've got some flat leaf parsley, which is just classic. It's used in so many different French recipes. Super aromatic fresh rosemary, thyme, which is one of the perennial herbs used in French cooking, and then bay leaf. And you'll notice this is fresh bay leaf, which I really prefer using. I have a bay tree at home as well. I love using fresh bay. It's got a completely different aroma than the dried. Dried is fine though if that's all you have, don't worry about that. And onion, of course, a really solid aromatic foundation for this recipe. And for good measure, a little butter. So the way I start is by putting onion in the base of the pan. Doesn't have to be fancy or anything. I just slice it kind of thickly because it's going to be in the oven a long time, so it's got plenty of time to cook. One of the benefits here is not only that the onion adds flavor, but it also serves as a base in the pan, and it helps keep the chicken from sticking to the pan. So later when you've got this beautiful roast chicken, you're not trying to pry it up off the bottom of the pan. So this onion serves a double purpose. I put a little bit of the herb in the bottom here with the onion, some of the bay leaves, a couple pieces of the fresh rosemary just as is. And then the chicken's going to go in on top. So for a lot of whole roast chicken recipes, you might see a recommendation that you truss the bird first. I personally don't find that's absolutely necessary. I just do one quick thing before I put the bird in the pan, and that's to tuck these little wing ends under. So I simply take this wing flap, flip it backwards under the back of the bird, and you see it sort of stabilizes the bird, and this little wing edge isn't going to burn while it roasts. So I do that on the other side as well. That's pretty much all there is to it. So I'm going to take the chicken, set it in the pan on those herbs, and then these other herbs, I am just going to take whole sprigs and put them inside the bird. And this is going to add some more aroma that's going to infuse the meat from the inside. And then we have those other herbs underneath where the aroma of those herbs is going to be infusing from the bottom and contributing to, again, those delicious pan juices. And then I just add a little bit of softened butter. It's been out at room temperature. It should be nice and soft so you can easily spread it over. It doesn't have to be wildly accurate. Don't worry about covering every single inch perfectly. But I do like to just cover the bird with some of this butter, which contributes again to that browning. We know that butter is always, always good for helping things brown. And even though the skin's dried out, we don't want it to get too dry. So this is sort of a way of keeping a little bit of moisture intact without the bird being wet. And then it's just a matter of adding some salt and pepper. I have some sea salt here, just sprinkle over. And then some pepper. And I do really much prefer to always use freshly ground pepper if that's not a problem for you. Easy enough to have this on hand. And another option you have, if you prefer not to use the softened butter, is to simply drizzle a little bit of olive oil over the top. I do that a lot at home too. Just a simple little drizzle. You don't even have to rub it around too much. Again, it just contributes to the browning and a really luxurious, crispy skin in the end. So my lovely chicken is all ready to go with the herbs and the onion, the butter, the salt, and the pepper. It's going into my oven, and we'll check it in about an hour. So the chicken's been in the oven for about an hour, and I wish you were here to smell how great it smells. The aroma of the onions and the herbs and the chicken is just delightful, but you're going to smell that too when you cook this at home. I'm going to pull it out, just take a look at how it's doing. It's probably nice and brown, but I want to make sure it's cooked through before I make sure that it's done. Nice and sizzly. So the way I like to test for doneness is to actually lift the bird up and tip it a little bit and see what color the juices are coming out of the cavity. When the bird is fully cooked, those juices are going to be clear, and when it's not quite done, they're still going to be a little bit red. So I just use a nice, sturdy, long-handled fork, pick the bird up, and tip it. And you'll see those are really red still. So we've got a little bit to go to get to the point where the bird is cooked through. I'm going to go ahead and set that back down. But while I'm here, I also see that the onions are getting a little brown around the edges, which is actually really good because that's going to be contributing flavor in the long run. But now's a good time to add a little bit of vermouth to just moisten the pan a little bit and avoid it getting too dark through the rest of the cooking. A little bit of vermouth, not all of it. We're going to use more later to make the pan sauce. So now the pan just goes back in the oven, and we'll keep cooking until those juices do in fact run clear when I test it next time. While our chicken is in the oven right now roasting, I'm going to take a second and show you one really quick little technique you might use for another time when you're making roast chicken. It's called spatchcocking. It's a really simple technique. It allows you to flatten the bird a little bit, and it roasts a little bit more quickly, and it can be a little more versatile. For instance, it's a little bit easier to grill a bird flat as a spatchcock than it is in whole form out on your backyard grill. So this is just a fun little technique to have both for chicken. It's great for guinea hen, quail, any whole bird. Very simple. Just turn the bird over to start with, and what you're going to do is cut away the backbone to start. And this is where it's important to have a nice pair of heavy shears. These are poultry type shears, and you'll see, I hope, that there's a little teeny bit of sort of a ridged edge here. And what that's going to do is actually help grip the chicken as you go through to cut. When you have shears that don't have that little edge on them, it can be a little slippery to try to gain some traction as you're cutting through the bird. So just start at the tail end, and the tail is a great indication of where that backbone is. So you're basically going to cut down either side of this backbone. Very simple technique. You just literally are using these nice heavy shears to cut straight through all the way to the back to the other end of the bird. You see there's the other end of the backbone. And we just do exactly the same thing on the other side. See? Super easy. Now, you turn the bird back over on the breast side, sort of flay those leg portions out a little bit. And here's the hardest part. Take your hand, the palm of your hand, up towards the breast end and just push down and flatten that breast a little bit. Gives you a little bit of a better opportunity to get an even sort of flat surface that's going to cook really evenly when you roast this bird. You can do the same thing with the wings that we did with the whole bird. Just tuck those wing ends under. And from this point forward, you can cook it just as we did the whole chicken. You can lay this on that bed of onions and herbs. You could take this to the grill and grill it. And it's just one of many variations on roasted chicken, which includes things like even just brushing the top of this with a little bit of Dijon mustard. You can season it with smoked paprika, any number of things. It's really a great foundation to start with. This is just one other way to do it. So the chicken's been in the oven for about another 30 minutes or so, and I'm going to check again to see what color those juices are coming out of the cavity. I have a feeling it's probably ready to go. And you can see it's gotten quite a lot browner, and it smells even better right now. So the same technique as earlier, long handled fork, lift it up, turn it to the side. You can see those juices coming out. There's less of them now, but you can see that they're clear. They're not red like they were earlier. So the chicken's done. I'm going to go ahead and transfer it to the chopping board where I'm going to be carving it in a little bit and let it sit, covered with foil. Get these herbs back in the pan. Cover it with foil to keep warm. And then I'm going to go ahead and work on this pan sauce. So it's just going to sit there happily. And you see all these beautiful liquids we have in the pan. Those onions got brown and they're contributing flavor and color to the sauce, which is just great. We've got some liquids that are both chicken juices. There's that little bit of vermouth I put in earlier, and those herbs, which have picked up a lot of flavor. So I'm just going to turn this burner on low. I don't want it to be very, very hot. We just want to reduce a teeny bit. I'm going to add some more of this vermouth. A dry vermouth. Brightens the flavor. It blends with those rich chicken juices and that sort of caramelized onion flavor. And at the same time, you can use those juices to soften and dissolve some of these browner bits around the edge that have great, great flavor. This is where it's important to keep in mind that the roasting pan you chose at the beginning to put the chicken in is one that you know is going to be comfortable going on top of the stove, since this is really the easiest way to finish the sauce. So I'm just going to let this come to a low boil, simmer gently, and it'll reduce a little bit and create a really delightful, simple pan sauce for the chicken. So the pan juices have been simmering for maybe 5-7 minutes or so. This is really just an eyeball thing. I'm just looking for the fact that they've thickened a little bit. We're not getting to a super thick sauce. It's really just to reduce the texture a little bit so it's not too watery. You may find, depending on the bird that you use, that that you see a lot of fat accumulating around the edge of the pan. I don't see a lot with this particular chicken. If you're concerned about the fat that you might end up with in that final sauce, you can always tip the pan gently and scoop off some of that extra fat with a big spoon. But I find that there's usually not too much to worry about, and as it simmers down with the onions and the vermouth and the herbs, it just creates a really delightful flavor. So I think it's good to go. I'm going to go ahead and turn this off and turn my attention to carving the chicken now. So I just take the foil off, obviously, and that keeps it nice and warm. It will be ready to serve here in just a couple of minutes. Here's a good time to use one of those cutting boards that has a little ridge around the edges. You can see that invariably the chicken's going to put off some liquid while it sits, and it's just handy to have these ridges to catch those juices instead of letting them run all over your counter. I know it happens to me still all the time. So we'll use our same carving fork to help with this operation. I'm going to be putting my pieces on this lovely rustic platter as I go. I always start by separating the leg and thigh portion from the body of the meat. So you cut very gently through here, you're going to see that it's actually just a separation between the thigh and the breast. You cut through the skin. You're not actually cutting through meat yet. And as you go, bend that thigh portion back, cut along that edge, along the bottom, and you're going to find the joint here where the thigh meets the body of the bird. That comes off easily. When it's well cooked, that just flips back really easily. Continue on through, and you have a thigh and leg portion, which I usually serve as is, but if you prefer, you can go ahead and cut that into two pieces, cutting between the thigh and the leg, in which case you'll end up with 8 pieces of chicken if you're looking to serve a larger crowd. So there's one of our legs, piece of thigh. Turn the bird around, same thing on the other side. Cutting that skin that's all nice and crisp now, right between where the thigh leg portion is and where the breast meat is. And you bend that thigh back and you'll see this joint becomes clear to see. Cut straight through that. There you have another leg and thigh portion. Cut straight between the leg and the thigh. There you go. And then how I proceed from here is to take the knife, cut just above the wing joint inward to sort of create a base cut for the breast meat, and then simply cut downward along that breast to cut off lovely thick pieces of that meat. At the back of the bird here is the wishbone, which can get a little bit in the way, make that last bit of breast meat a little hard to get at, but it's usually not too big a problem. And then just turn the bird, continue exactly the same way on the other side. Cutting away that juicy, aromatic meat. Boy, that smells so good. You can definitely smell all those herbs that have been infusing flavor into that meat as it roasts. All these nice crispy skin bits that the cook gets to enjoy in the kitchen before serving this. This is definitely a rustic roast chicken. There you go. All that lovely browned skin with the salt and the pepper and the butter contributed to all that lovely golden color. So just a couple last little pieces of meat here. And I want to show you one little bit of delicate meat that you may or may not know is on the bottom of the chicken. And this is, again, something that you can enjoy at home and you don't even have to tell your guests about it. But if you turn the bird over, right where the breast had been, right where the front of the breast was, is this lovely little nugget of meat that sits in this little indentation of bone. It's called the oyster. And it's just really super delicate, really delightful flavor. It's been sitting right on top of those herbs and onions, so it's almost one of the very best bites in the bird. I just wanted to let you know, you don't have to tell your dinner guests, it's something you should enjoy. So now we're done with the carving of the bird. I've got my little pan sauce over here that's ready to go. In a nicer restaurant, if I had a 3-star restaurant at home instead of just my delightful home kitchen, I might strain this and create a little bit fancier sauce, but at home, when it's Tuesday night and I've made roast chicken for dinner, this is pretty much what I do. I just tip the pan, collect some of those sauces, some of those juices, and I just drizzle it right over the bird. Look how lovely and brown they are from, again, those chicken juices, but also the roast onion, the color that it takes on as it bakes. It's just really, really delightful, simple, delightful flavor. And then I even pick up some of these pieces of roasted onion. It's just got such wonderful flavor. It's been cooking in those pan juices and those herbs for so long. It's a lovely complement to a classic roast chicken. A nice little flourish of some fresh thyme. It smells absolutely divine. And that's pretty much all there is to it. Absolutely classic French poulet rôti. In the next lesson, our attention is going to turn to beef stew. In this case, it's going to be a really traditional, simple beef and mushroom stew. It's a great foundation recipe from which you can create any number of variations. You're going to have a lot of fun with this in the kitchen. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the right cuts of meat to use for a beef stew. I'm also going to show you one of many ways to thicken stew. In this case, I'm going to be using a beurre manier, a very simple paste of softened butter and flour that's going to thicken the stew just luxuriously. See you then. Welcome back to French Home Cooking, The Essential Techniques. I'm Cynthia Nims. So now it's time to get rolling with the beef stew. I've got almost all of my prep ready. I'm just going to finish a couple things here. What we're going to learn in this next lesson is a few things to help you make a really delicious stew at home. It's going to start with talking about the particular cuts of beef that are ideal to use. I'm going to show you one of many techniques for thickening the stew. In this case, we're going to use a beurre manier, or this very simple butter flour mixture. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about some of the possible variations on this really basic foundation of beef stew. So to begin with, I'm just going to finish chopping up my onion, which is one of the aromatics that we're going to use in the stew. Super simple technique. Just start by cutting lengthwise slices through the onion, not all the way through exactly, so just so it helps hold the onion together. You simply turn the onion, cut across, and you get a really nice dice. So I can add that to the bowl with the rest of my onions. There are also some carrots that will be going into the stew to cook with the meat and add their aromatic sort of sweet flavor. And then I'm also going to use some garlic. And because this stew cooks a long, long time, there's going to be plenty of time for this garlic to cook. I don't really need to worry about mincing it very, very finely. It's going to cook very easily over the couple of hours, even in whole form. But I am going to crush it a little bit, which helps if I crush it a little bit, it helps take the skin off, and it also helps the flavors release much more quickly. So I simply lay a whole clove on the cutting board, put my knife flat on the side, hold it carefully, and then just a light tap on your hand, and it splits the skin and makes it easy to get the garlic clove out. So I'm going to do that again, just flat on the cutting board, knife blade flat on the garlic clove, a light tap, and that skin pops off. If I were mincing this is also a great first step, not only to peel the garlic, but it also helps get a start on chopping it. So it's a little bit broken up. It's a lot easier to chop when it's crushed a little bit first. One last time, peeling off that skin. So these crushed garlic cloves are going to go in with the carrots and onion at the beginning of the stew after I brown the meat. This is our ingredients, the butter. Over here we have the softened butter and flour. They're going to be used for the beurre manier later to thicken the stew. Some flavorful liquids include red wine, a little bit of beef stock, have some herbs, fresh bay leaves, fresh thyme. And because this is a beef and mushroom stew, we've got quite a lot of traditional white mushrooms here. They have been quartered. These are quite large mushrooms, so they've been quartered. If yours are smaller, they can be just halved if you like. So when it comes to cleaning these mushrooms, I prefer to just use a damp paper towel and lightly brush the surface of the mushroom with the paper towel to remove any dirt or debris. I really don't like to wash mushrooms in water, in the sink, because the mushrooms are just going to absorb that water, and later they will give that water off as they cook, and that's really not going to contribute to the dish. So just damp paper towel is awesome. One really fun variation, if you happen to be lucky enough to have a lot of fresh wild mushrooms around, you could certainly use fresh wild mushrooms in place of some or all of these fresh mushrooms. And then another alternative that's great year-round is using some dried wild mushrooms in addition to the fresh mushrooms. You probably wouldn't want to use just the dried mushrooms, but they add a really delightful flavor and texture contrast to fresh if you want to use them. These are pieces of dried porcini mushroom, which are far too dry and brittle to use directly. So all you have to do is put them in a little dish of water. Warm water is fine, doesn't have to be hot water. Let them sit for 15 or 20 minutes. You see they become much more pliable, and then you can chop them up and add them to the stew with the other mushrooms. And the nice bonus here when you use dried mushrooms is that this water that they're soaking in is actually taking on some delightful flavor too. So don't throw that out, actually use it. In the case of this stew, you could use it in place of part of that stock. It's gonna add extra flavor. The only thing I recommend is that you maybe not pour the whole bowl of water in, because sometimes there's a little bit of grit that will collect at the bottom after the dried mushrooms are reconstituted. Don't forget to download the course materials so you'll have all the information you need about ingredient quantities, specific steps of the recipe, everything you're going to need to remember everything I'm showing you here today. Next up, I'm going to pull out the beef, I'm going to cube it up, and we'll get rolling on cooking the stew. So here we have it, the star of the show for this beef stew. This is a lovely piece of chuck. It's got a lot of fat that you'll see running through the meat. There's connective tissue. This is a really ideal type of recipe to use a less expensive piece of meat. There's no reason to use tenderloin. There's no reason to get a luxurious ribeye steak. This is actually what you want for a stew, because this connective tissue and all this fat is going to contribute flavor and really tender texture after it's cooked. When you're doing a lamb stew or a pork stew, it's the same principle. Get a sort of shoulder cut or a butt roast for pork. Anything that's got this sort of connective tissue and fat is going to make a really delicious stew. I prefer to start a stew with a large piece of meat like this that I can cut myself into the cubes the size that I want. And also, even though the stew meat that you see in the store can be super convenient and it's certainly great to use on occasion, it's hard to know exactly what kind of meat that might be. It might be a little leaner, and you may not end up with the kind of results you really want. So again, I really prefer to start with a chuck piece and just cut it myself. So I'm going to start by just cutting across into pieces about 1 inch thick. And then it's simply a matter of cutting across into strips. And then across again into cubes that are about 1 inch square. If you get to a piece of meat that has what seems to be an excessive amount of fat, you can certainly cut chunks like this out if you feel like it, just to save a little bit of fat from the dish. But it's really not necessary, because in the course of the few hours that this is going to cook, that fat's actually going to melt away into the cooking liquids, and it's going to help make the meat as tender as possible. So I'm going to go ahead and just keep cubing up my meat, and in a second we're going to start cooking it. So now that I have my beef all cubed, I'm going to take a moment and season it with a little bit of salt and some freshly ground pepper. And I've got a nice heavy soup pot or Dutch oven type of a pot here. Do try to use a really sturdy, heavy pan for something like this. You want something that's going to distribute the heat evenly and hold it really well for that long cooking time. And be sure to pick a pot that's got a lid that's going to fit securely too, because you want to be sure and hold in all those juices while the stew is cooking. And I have let this preheat for a couple of minutes because, again, because it's a really heavy pot, it takes a little bit longer to preheat than your average saucepan. A little bit of oil in the bottom to get things rolling. Heat's on about medium. And when you're browning meat for a stew like this, it's really important to not crowd the pan. So I'm just going to brown it in batches, make sure there's plenty of room for the meat to brown. If I put too much meat in at once, the meat's going to start giving off its juices and it'll just be impossible to brown. It's going to end up stewing too quickly. We actually want to get some brown color on there first. So I'm just going to let it cook for a couple of minutes undisturbed. Want it to actually create a little bit of a brown crust. And it's nice to hear that sizzle. That helps me know that the pan was good and hot before I started. Actually, if you put in a piece and it doesn't sizzle at all, you might want to just take it out, let the pan heat for another minute or two, because this is really what you want to accomplish. You can see the color that's already coming on. That's great. You don't need to worry about being super precise about absolutely browning each side of all of these cubes evenly, but you basically want to be sure that every piece does get a little bit of brown on it, contributes flavor to the overall dish. It's already starting to contribute flavor to the pan, actually, that's going to be picked up later by onions and carrots and other ingredients that go in here. Let them cook for another couple of minutes, gain some more flavor. I like to use a slotted spoon at this point. It's a little bit easier to maneuver, and I'm going to want this slotted spoon rather than sort of a flat type wooden spoon. A little bit easier to maneuver the meat when I need to transfer it out of the dish. So you can see there's some nice color on these cubes now. This is plenty. We're just par cooking them now. We're getting a little bit of brown color on the outside. I'm going to go ahead and scoop these out. I'm going to keep cooking the rest of this meat in batches, just like I did this one. And we'll come back shortly when all the meat's brown and continue with the rest of building the stew. So this is the last batch of those beef cubes. It's just finishing its time in the pot getting browned. So I'm going to go ahead and add them to the bowl with the rest of the beef. And that's just going to sit aside for a little bit while I continue with the vegetables. And look at all that great brown surface that we have in the pot. That is actually contributing a whole lot of really delicious flavor. So I'm going to go right ahead and add the onion that's been chopped directly to the pan. As well as these pieces of carrot and these 3 crushed garlic cloves. I'm going to stir them around. They're going to cook in that same delicious cooking liquids that the beef cooked in. They're going to pick up a lot of that brown flavor that the beef cubes started. It's going to take a few minutes, maybe even 5 or 7 minutes. We want to see that the onions are starting to actually brown and soften a little bit. We're not necessarily worried about cooking them all the way through. We just want to get their cooking process started and again sort of pick up and take advantage of some of that flavor that's in the pot from when we browned the beef. I'm just going to let them sit for a few minutes. Stir them down again. They don't need to be stirred all the time. Just want to help them cook kind of evenly, and when we start seeing that the onions are lightly browned and the carrots are starting to brown a little bit, then I'll proceed, add the red wine, and we'll move on to the next step of the cooking process. So it's been about 5 or 6 minutes. You can see these onions have taken on some really great brown color. The garlic's browning a little bit, some of the carrots are browning. So now it's a good time to go ahead and proceed. And the very next step is adding some red wine. And what's going to happen with the red wine is a process called deglazing. And it's sort of with the idea that this delicious brown stuff that's stuck to the bottom of the pan is a really great glaze of flavor. And when you add liquid to a pan like this, it deglazes or helps bring up that flavor, those cooked bits from the bottom of the pan. So I'm just going to stir that in for a little bit. Stir around some to help draw up, again, a lot of those cooked bits. It's going to be in the oven for a while, so it's not certainly a concern that you need to get every little dose of flavor up. It's just one nice little step that helps jumpstart getting the most out of this braising process. As far as the wine to use, it's really that you want to choose a wine good enough to drink, not something you wouldn't want to drink, but it doesn't have to be a super fancy wine. Save the really elegant 1985 Cabernet to sip alongside the stew. But for a recipe like this, I use a really great sort of everyday sipping wine, something that's maybe a Cab Merlot blend, a Rhone blend, you know, an inexpensive Merlot, that's great. But just make sure it's something that you would actually enjoy drinking. So now that this is deglazed a little bit, I'm going to go ahead and return the beef to the pan. All these browned pieces. There's juices that have collected in the bowl too, and I'm going to go ahead and add them as well. There's certainly a lot of flavor they're going to bring to the stew as well. Let's just incorporate that a little bit. And then I add some beef stock. And here it's an important consideration that there's not a specific amount of beef stock to add. You'll see in the recipe I might say something like 1.5 to 2 cups. I really think it's more important to add less liquid than needed than to add too much liquid, because later it becomes harder to thicken the stew. I'd rather have to add a little bit of liquid through the process than wish I hadn't put so much in the first place. So I'm going to add about 1 cup of the stock, see what it looks like. I basically want it to be about halfway up the side of the meat. And that measure is also going to vary depending on the type of the pan that you use. If it's narrower and taller, the proportions are a little bit different. So this is definitely a place where you want to eyeball it rather than just go by a strict measurement. I'm going to go ahead and put a little bit more in. Again, I want to see it sort of coming up about halfway up the thickness of the pan where the meat is. I think that's looking pretty good. Now for some herbal aromatics. I'm adding just directly into the pan a few sprigs of fresh thyme and a couple of bay leaves. Again, I really like using fresh bay leaves if at all possible. You can certainly use dry bay leaves if you like. This is a place where in a lot of classic French cooking you may have heard the term bouquet garni, which is a little bundle of herbs, often bay, thyme, parsley, it can be other herbs as well, tied in a little package and traditionally thrown into a stew like this. It's certainly what I learned in cooking school. But again, I think it's just as simple. You get a lot of flavor from the herbs directly in the pot, and it's just a little bit easier, one less step to worry about when you're cooking at home. So I put the herbs right in the pot like this. Add the nice sturdy heavy lid that comes with the Dutch oven. Now it's just going in the oven. It's going to take about an hour before we're going to be ready to put in the mushrooms. So the meat and the vegetables and all those delicious cooking juices are going to have about an hour. We'll take it out, add the mushrooms, and continue finishing the stew from there. So the stew has been in the oven for about an hour now. It's time for me to add the mushrooms. The only reason I don't add these mushrooms at the beginning with the other ingredients is they don't really need that much cooking time. I want them to cook through certainly, but I don't want them to be so cooked they become overly soft. So I add them about 2/3 of the way through, which is now. Look at that. You can see all those luxurious cooking juices in there. It smells really, really delightful. This looks like a lot of mushrooms, but they are going to cook down, so don't worry too much. It looks a little bit overwhelming. But I am going to add all of these fresh mushrooms. Stir a bit just to incorporate them somewhat. You don't have to be too meticulous about it. But I do just want them to be distributed a little bit with the beef and the other vegetables. Boy, that smells divine. So now it's on with the lid and back in the oven. If at this point I saw quite a lot of juices and it seemed to be maybe even too much, if I saw liquid that was coming up close to the top of the meat, which I'm not, but if it was more liquid, I would probably put the lid a little bit askew. So in this last part of cooking, some of that extra liquid evaporated off. But right now I'm pretty happy. They're still at about half level, so I'm just gonna go ahead and put the lid all the way on. About 30 minutes or so, when those mushrooms are done, we'll finish the stew, we'll thicken it, and we will be ready to serve. And as I told you earlier, I'm going to be thickening this stew with what's called a beurre manier, which is very simply softened butter and flour, generally equal parts of each. So I've got the flour in my dish. Make sure again, that the butter's really soft, because if it's not going to evenly incorporate with the flour. So go ahead and put them together. I just use a good old table fork. Gently blend them together. You're just trying to make a rather inelegant looking paste. The butter and the flour mixed together like this into a paste before going into the stew just helps incorporate more quickly and evenly, and it has a much better result for the thickening. If we were just to add flour directly to the stew, it would clump up, it wouldn't mix in evenly, it wouldn't have a very good effect. By mixing the butter and flour together first, it just helps make it that much more efficient when we thicken the stew later. So once again, butter to the rescue. So that's all there is to it. Just a nice, smooth mixture. I'm going to set this aside, and we'll use it in a little bit when the stew's ready to be finished. So it's been another 45 minutes or so, and I'm pretty sure those mushrooms are cooked, which pretty much means the stew is ready to go. So I am going to start by taking off the lid. Oh yeah, it's looking really delicious. Mushrooms are looking tender. Isn't it interesting how much the mushrooms cook down so quickly? And they really aren't as large a volume as they sort of looked when they first went in the pot. Now, before I thicken the stew with my beurre manier, I do want to go ahead and take these herb sprigs out because I don't want to forget later. And you'll see the thyme went in with all of its little leaves on, and a lot of those leaves have fallen off. They're distributed in the stew now, adding great flavor, and it's really easy. Now it's just a matter of taking these sprigs out and just throw them away. Helps if you remember how many you put in, so you remember how many you have to get out. And we also had 2 bay leaves. There's another one in there somewhere, I just know it. And look at these beautiful, rich, brown cooking liquids. There's my other bay leaf. This is going to be a delicious stew. Just want to make sure I didn't miss any of my herbs. I think we're good, hopefully. Not the end of the world if I find a little bit later. So now we have this beurre manier, again, that very, very simple paste of softened butter and flour. I'm going to put in just about half of it. Again, this is not an exact science. Every batch of stew is going to have slightly different amount of liquids in the pot. They might have thickened themselves to different degrees. So really you just want to add that classic enough, which is not always exact and not always the same from one batch to the next. So I'm going to put in about half. I'm going to turn my heat on really low. There's a lot of heat that's already conserved, from the oven. This pan is going to stay pretty hot for a while, but I'm going to put it on low just to help with cooking of these juices and thickening them. And I just want to gently, I don't want to stir like mad because I don't want to break up all the pieces of vegetable and meat, but incorporate that beurre manier and let it cook for a minute. And then I'll decide if I need to put a little bit more in. Scrape down some of that extra delicious brown cooking juices from the sides. Let this come to a little bit of a boil. The aroma is really something. So it's simmered for a couple of minutes after that first addition of the beurre manier, that about half of what I made earlier, and it's still a little bit thinner than I would like. So I'm going to go ahead and add some more. Again, not an exact science. You really do want to just sort of go steadily, put in a little bit at a time, see how it goes. Stir gently. You do want it to be well incorporated, but again, I don't want to stir madly and break up all the pieces of meat and the vegetables. I want them to still hold their shape. Let's see, now there, it's getting quite a lot thicker already. So I think that's going to be good. Can you see that, how the sauce is thickening up? It's even coating as I stir the meat. You can see it's starting to cling to and coat the beef and the carrots and all those delicious mushrooms that were in there. Yep, I think that's just about right. It's got a nice proportion of liquid to the meat and the vegetables. It's not too soupy, it's not too liquidy. Got a lot of really rich meat here. This is going to make a wonderful, wonderful meal, particularly on those sort of blustery evenings when it's a little bit cooler outside. So what we have here basically is a pretty standard ragout de boeuf, or beef stew, just with classic beef, carrots, onions, mushrooms. Pretty unregional. It's something you might find anywhere in France. But throughout the country there are some very distinct regional types of beef stew, which you may have heard of. One down in Provence is known as daube. It's spelled D-A-U-B-E, daube. And that often has some orange zest that's added earlier and adds an aromatic citrus element to the stew from the beginning. And you might finish that with black olives. It's really got a lot of aroma, and it's got a really distinct sort of Provençal character. Up in Burgundy is boeuf bourguignon, one of the very most traditional beef stews in France. And there you would use Burgundy wine traditionally. And the accents to that stew are classically little pearl onions, bacon, lardons, the sort of thicker bacon pieces commonly used in France, and mushrooms as well. So that's a classic boeuf bourguignon. And then when you get up towards Belgium, there's another beef stew that's known as carbonade. And there, in place of the red wine, they use beer, which kind of makes sense in Belgium, I suppose. And then there's also a lot of onions. So it's a very onion-heavy stew with beef and that really aromatic, rich flavor from the beer. And of course, what we have here is a really classic, delicious ragout de boeuf. Simple, delicious, you can't go wrong. Up next, we'll have a lesson on the French way with potatoes. I'll give you some tips about techniques to make the most of a potato gratin and a potato puree. I'll tell you a little bit about how to choose the best potato for each of those preparations. I'm also going to give you some tips for fun, easy, delicious variations on both of those recipes. See you soon. Welcome back to French Home Cooking, The Essential Techniques. I'm Cynthia Nims. In this next lesson, I'll be focusing on the French way with potatoes. I'll be featuring two different techniques. One, a potato gratin, the other, a really luxurious puree of potato, or sort of mashed potato done French style. We're going to talk about two different types of potatoes and how to choose the best type for each of these two dishes. I'm also going to talk to you a little bit about variations and how easy it is to take these really standard classic techniques and vary them with different ingredients and different approaches where you can have a lot of creative fun in the kitchen. I'm going to start with a potato gratin. which is going to use a waxy type of potato. It holds up really well to this kind of baking. It's going to absorb some delicious cream and some other flavors in the oven, and it's my preferred type of potato for a gratin. There are yellowfin potatoes, Yukon Gold potatoes, your classic sort of white potato. They're all in this waxy family that you can use for this type of recipe. The other type of standard potato that you often see is a baker or a russet type of potato. This I'll be using in the next recipe for a mashed potato. It's a little starchier and it creates a really delightful fluffy texture for a puree. Technically, you can do either of these recipes with either potato. You'll have slightly different results, but I just prefer to focus on the puree with the russet and a waxy potato for the gratin, and that's where I'm going to start with the gratin. So I have, you do want to peel the potatoes for a gratin. Sometimes it's nice to leave them on. You certainly can if you prefer, but I just like the texture and it's a little bit nicer look in the long run if you've peeled the potatoes in advance. So I have a lot of potatoes already peeled here, and they're in a bowl of water to help avoid discoloration. But before I get to slicing them for the gratin, I want to go ahead and prepare my pan and do a little bit of other preparation before we build this dish, put it in the oven. One of the most classic herbs that's used in quite a lot of French cooking is thyme. It has such a delicious savory flavor. It's not super strong. It can be used in any number of dishes, and it's just a really delightful light savory flavor that's going to add some character to this gratin. And so I wanted to show you how easy it is to remove the leaves from the thyme sprig and just chop it lightly. They are very small leaves, and in some dishes it's fine to go ahead and leave them whole, but for this preparation I do want to chop them a little bit. You'll see they're very fine little bits of leaves along the stem, and the easiest way to remove them is to simply run your finger backwards down the stem and all those little leaves come off. It's just really, really easy. So I'm going to do a little bit more of that. Make a little pile of thyme that will be then easy to chop all together. This is a really easy herb to grow as well. I'm not a really great gardener, I gotta admit, but I do have a number of fresh herbs in the garden, and it's one of those really delightful, simple pleasures of life to be able to walk out my front door and grab some fresh herbs like thyme to add to a dish like this. So I highly recommend it if you don't have fresh herbs at home, even a windowsill or a balcony. It can be easy. I think that'll be enough for this dish. So then it's simply a matter, just to make it tidy, I try to sort of group the little leaves together in a pile and then simply run my chef's knife over the pile a little bit, sort of move things around so you're cutting the leaves in slightly different directions each time. Reform the pile, go across. It doesn't have to be super duper fine mince, but even as you start chopping them, you're going to smell those aromatic oils, and the character of the herb really comes out even with a little bit of chopping, which is another benefit. Not only does it make them smaller and distribute a little bit more evenly in a dish like this, but it also brings out the flavor. So there's my fresh thyme for later. Now I'm going to go ahead and prepare the gratin dish as well. I have, this is a really super classic gratin dish. You don't want it to be too deep, so one of the characteristics of a classic gratin is that it's on the shallower side. I like oval. I'm not sure why. It's probably just as much aesthetic as anything else. Technically, a gratin will be just as delicious in a rectangular dish, so you can certainly use whatever you have available, but this is very much like the one I use at home all the time. For a little bit of extra flavor, you can rub a cut garlic clove around the inside of the pan. And if you really, really love garlic, it'll be among the variations you can do for the gratin at home. You could add actually minced garlic to the layers of potato, makes it a little bit stronger. But in this case, just rubbing the cut clove of garlic around the inside of the pan just adds a little bit more subtle garlic flavor. And then I'm going to use some of my softened butter to butter the inside of the pan as well. Boy, it smells good already. Garlic and butter are always a good start to any recipe as far as I'm concerned. There we go. So now my pan's ready. It's always good to make sure you get your pan prepped, whatever it is, buttering a cake pan, lining a baking sheet with foil, whatever you need to do for your recipe, always be sure to do that in advance so when the time comes to assemble your dish and bake it, you don't have to stop and deal with that later. I do want to preheat my half and half before it goes into the gratin, because if I put it in cold, it's only going to inhibit the baking time later. So if I preheat it, the potatoes aren't going to be chilled before as they go in the oven. So heating it in advance is a nice little step to remember. So I'm going to put my half and half in a small pan and just gently heat it while I'm preparing the rest of the gratin. When it comes to slicing potatoes, there are a lot of different ways you can approach it. You can certainly do it by hand with a chef's knife if you like, but I prefer to make sure that the slices are even, and that even with all my years of experience, it's sometimes hard to get super even slices with a regular chef's knife. So I do like to use a slicer at home. There are a lot of types of slicers out today, which is really awesome. So there's a lot of different sizes and shapes and prices. There's something for everybody. This is one of the larger types. It's got replaceable different types of blades, and you can adjust the thicknesses. This is a nice one. For me, it's just a little bigger than I feel like I need in my kitchen. This is an Asian type of slicer, which is super popular. It's got a slightly adjustable blade, and you can put little inserts in here, and you can do julienne and different types of slicing, which is great. But the one that I really love, and this is literally the one that I use all the time at home, is this little slicer. It doesn't look like a whole lot, but it's really super functional. It's got an incredibly sharp blade, and you can adjust it to 4 different settings by way of this little bar at the back. So this is what I really love to use. Really versatile for everything from garlic and carrots and radishes, and certainly these potatoes. The trick with slicers, though, I can tell you from experience, is they are sharp and it's easy to slip. It's really easy to cut yourself, and I've got a few scars I could show you to prove that. So it's really, really important when you're using slicers like this to take advantage of a couple different options to prevent cutting. This is the type of grip holder that comes with this particular model. It's got teeth to grab onto whatever food you're cutting, and then the idea is that you run it along the length of the slicer, and it keeps your hands from getting in contact. For my personal taste, it's a little hard for me to manage the food as well as I'd like. I prefer touching the food directly. So what I use is this cutting mitt that's now on the market, which I love. I have one of these at home that has shown some wear and tear, but it protects your fingers from the blade as you're cutting along with your food. So it's just as simple as this. Again, these have been in water just to prevent discoloration. Got it set. See, nice even slices, and it's quick. So using a slicer not only is good for making sure you get those even slices, but it's also super efficient. It helps you just cut a lot of potatoes really quickly. So you get the idea. I'm just going to keep slicing. I'm going to go through all of the potatoes in this bowl, and you'll be back with me in a minute when we have all the potatoes sliced. I'm going to go ahead and build the gratin, and we'll get it in the oven. So here I am on the last of those potatoes, got quite a pile here, and I'm ready now to go ahead and assemble the gratin and get on to the baking portion of this lesson. Now oh, I don't need this anymore. Thankfully, I'm not in too much risk of cutting myself anymore. So I'm going to go ahead and take these slices. You don't have to be super duper precise, but it is helpful if you make a relatively even layer as you're building the gratin. It'll just make for even cooking, and then the portion sizes later when you scoop it out is just going to be a little bit more even. So now a little bit of my salt. Not a ton. Remember, there is going to be another layer with salt above this. Some pepper. And about half of this freshly chopped thyme. turn down my half and half. Now I'm just going to go ahead and make one more layer. Finish this off. So now I'm down to the last few slices, just finishing up this layering. Scalloped a little bit, a little bit overlapping. Again, it's both a matter of having relatively even distribution of the potatoes. And of course, at this point, this is the top layer that's going to be seen when it's served. So having a little bit of this fun layering effect just adds to that presentation when you're done. So I finish this second layer with the same seasoning, a little bit of salt, some pepper, and the rest of my chopped thyme. Now I'm going to add my warm half and half. And what I like to do here, rather than just pouring it over the top and spreading all of the thyme and salt and stuff to the bottom of the pan, I want to be able to keep the seasonings on top and just pour the half and half to one side so it sort of seeps underneath without disturbing all the seasoning on top. And as these potatoes cook, they're going to absorb a lot of this delicious half and half. And it won't be, it seems like a lot of liquid, but as it cooks, again, it's going to absorb that. Some of it's going to evaporate as well, and this will end up being just really delicious and rich, but not liquidy, even though it sort of looks like it might be right now. And then I start the cooking with some foil on top, so we retain as much heat as possible and the potatoes cook efficiently. Even though I may or may not actually touch the surface of the potato, I do like to still make the precaution of lightly buttering the foil, the part that's going to be facing down onto the potatoes. Cover the dish, butter side down. And then one little trick I like to do too, because again we want some of that cream to evaporate while it bakes, is to open just one little corner so there's a vent for some of that steam and liquid to escape. And we're going to put this in the oven. It'll bake for about 20-25 minutes. The potatoes will be mostly cooked. Then we're going to take the foil off, finish cooking for a little bit longer until we're sure that all of that cream has been absorbed and or evaporated. And then there's a light gratin browning on top, which is really delicious. So I'm going to put it in the oven. We'll check back soon. So here we are about 15 or 20 minutes after I took the foil off. You can see there's a little bit of browning going on here. The half and half has absorbed into the potatoes and evaporated a little bit with that little vent that we made. And now it needs to sit for about 10 or 15 minutes. It's a little too delicate right now. Right out of the oven, it's nice and hot certainly, and it's going to actually stay hot because this gratin dish is going to hold that heat. But if you try to serve this right away, those layers are going to fall apart. So if you let it sit 10 or 15 minutes, I promise you it's going to stay nice and warm. It'll just be much easier to portion and serve. So we're good to go. A lovely classic potato gratin. All right, so we've been through one of the great ways that the French work with potatoes, that potato gratin, just thinly sliced, cooked in the oven, really rich and delicious. We're moving on to something a little more rich perhaps, equally delicious certainly, is the pomme puree or pureed potatoes. For this one, as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to use the russet type of potato, which has a slightly starchy, floury texture. And what that contributes to the end result is it's just going to be a little bit lighter and fluffier in texture than if you were to use one of those waxy type potatoes. So to begin with, I'm simply going to cut them in half. Partly it helps just to cook them a little bit more evenly, and when you have a particularly large potato, it also just helps the cooking process go a little bit more quickly as well. So I'm going to halve them. If you have a really, really large potato, sometimes those russets can be really, really big. You may want to quarter them instead. So I'm going to go ahead and just put them directly into a pan of cold water. It's important to start with cold water so the potatoes cook gently as that water warms up, and that will contribute to helping them cook more evenly. If I were to put these into a pan of already boiling water, the outside tends to cook more quickly, and you're less likely to get a nice even cooking all the way through the potato. Now I'm going to add a little salt. We want to be sure that the potatoes have a little bit of seasoning while they're simmering. And to start with, I'm going to go ahead and turn my heat up pretty high, medium, high, or high. You want to bring the water first up to a full rolling boil. Make sure the water is nice and hot. But it's pretty important to not actually boil the potatoes the whole time. If you do that, if you cook them at too high a heat, rolling boil, the outside's going to cook too quickly and start to sort of dissolve away from the potato. So once it hits that boil, reduce the heat to medium, medium-low, depending on your stove, and let it simmer gently. In that way, the potato's going to cook more evenly. The outside and the inside will cook a little more consistently, and in the end you're going to have a better result. So here I am, I'm going to bring it up to a boil, I'll turn it down to a simmer, and I'll check back in with you in 20 or 25 minutes when the potatoes are almost tender. So the potatoes have been simmering for about 25 minutes or so. Looks like they're done, but just to be sure, I'm going to go ahead and do the knife test, which means taking just a small paring knife and you poke into the potato and see that it comes off pretty easily. Check usually a couple of them. If it doesn't go in very easily, the knife blade, or it doesn't come off the potato very easily, it probably needs a few more minutes, maybe even 5. Just get them to the point where the knife comes off easily when you test it. So now it's just a matter of draining them. I've got a colander in the sink. I'm just going to take the pan over there. Pour them into the colander, a little bit gently. It's not a problem now if the potatoes fall apart a little bit, but you kind of want them to hold their shape so they'll be easier to work with later. And then one of the tricks here is to let them sit in the sink for a while. So you can see that there's steam coming off. That's going to carry away excess moisture so that later when we go to puree the potatoes, they'll be less watery. We want to get all that excess moisture off. So I'm going to let them sit in the sink for a while until I don't see any more steam coming off, and then I'll proceed with passing them through the food mill and finishing this beautiful plum puree. So my potatoes are all cooked and they've cooled completely. I'm going to show you how I like to peel the skin off after they're cooked. It's a lot easier then. But first I'm going to talk to you a little bit about different options you have for pureeing the potatoes or mashing them. This is a food mill, which is a really awesome tool. It comes usually with a few different blade options. You'll see I have a fine blade here ready to go for the potato puree, and it comes with a couple of other larger blades that you might use for tomato sauces or fruit purees or any number of other preparations. This is a really handy tool. I'll be perfectly honest, I didn't have one until a few years ago. I used to mash my potatoes with just this large, oversized, sturdy whisk that I have at home. But once I got one of these and actually did it a couple times for potatoes, I realized it creates a much lighter, fluffier result in the long run. So now I'm a big fan of using a food mill for mashed potatoes. This masher you're probably familiar with. It's one of the classic tools that's been used for mashing potatoes. It's the same principle as I used to use with my big whisk, but the beauty here is, of course, that it's flat across the bottom and it's a little more efficient. I find it creates a slightly denser type of mashed potato, which is not necessarily a bad thing, just a different style. But today I'm going to use this food mill. So I'm going to go ahead and set it directly on top of my pan. And here are those potatoes that are fully cooled. And again, having cooked them with the skin on, it's really not hard now to go ahead and just peel away the skin. Leaving the skin on while they cook helps with a couple of things. One is I find that it helps assure that the potato holds together while it cooks. It's a little bit of protection. And I haven't done like a side-by-side taste test, but I have heard people mention that it also helps contribute a little bit more flavor. You get a little bit more of that sort of traditional potato-y flavor with the skin cooked on. And you also tend to lose a little bit less. See how thin the potato skin is coming off. If you peel them in advance, you tend to get some of that flesh that comes off as well. So you get a little bit more efficiency getting the most out of that potato. And just to make it a little bit easier for getting them through the food mill. I'm going to go ahead and just cut them into slightly smaller pieces, a little bit more efficient. There we go. Now it's just a matter of adding a few pieces at a time to the food mill. And you just crank. And then just add a few more as you go. Running backwards now and again helps just make sure it's grabbing all of the potato that's in your mill. So you'll see it's pressing the potato through and it comes out in these very fine little shreds, which is really wonderful. It's going to contribute a lot to that sort of lighter, fluffier texture. I'm going to go ahead and keep pressing the potato through. And we'll come back in a second and we'll add the cream and the butter. Okay, so now I've got all of those potatoes pressed through the mill. Looks like we're good to go. It's important to note there's invariably going to be some stuck up here in the bottom, so take your wooden spoon and scrape that last bit off to get all the goodness in the pan. Set that aside. I'm going to go ahead and turn my heat on to medium now. And just for extra assurance to get rid of any lingering moisture in these potatoes, it doesn't hurt to take a minute or so to stir them over this medium heat, make sure they're nice and dry. It's kind of funny because we are going to be adding cream and butter, which make it a little bit less dry in a moment, but this way we know that in the end the flavor and richness is going to come from the cream and the butter, and we don't have too much excess water in there that's going to make the potatoes runny or not quite as thick and luscious. I think that looks pretty good. You can see they're looking pretty thick, got a nice texture. We don't see any residual water or steam coming out. So I'm going to start by pouring over my cream, which has been warmed up here on the pan. Having it pre-warm, again, just sort of helps, as when we added the half and half with the gratin, it helps assure that we're not cooling down the potatoes when we add cold cream. So I'm going to work this in first. Stir gently. You don't want to stir too quickly here, or you might splash that cream out. So gently get it worked into the potatoes. Looks pretty good. And then we're going to start adding the butter. There's no absolute on how much butter you need to add. You certainly want enough to add flavor and richness. You can take that flavor and richness a little farther if you like by adding maybe a couple extra tablespoons. But you want to have at least probably 4 or 5 in there to start with to make sure you've got enough flavor and enough of that rich texture that you associate it with a good plum puree. So as the potatoes are warming up here, butter's going to be melting in. Texture's going to start to lighten up. You can certainly, if you are looking for something that's maybe not quite so rich, you can use whole milk in place of the cream, or even half and half, certainly. Any of those will be fine. You will just have a slightly less rich result in the end, which I'm sure you know comes with not using the cream, but there are options there for sure. So I'm just going to keep stirring this until I see for sure that all that butter has melted in, which is why you'll see that I put the butter in pre-cut into pieces. So it'll help just sort of melt and incorporate into potatoes a little bit more quickly. It's looking silky. Just going to keep stirring here for another few minutes until I see that all that butter is incorporated and I'm sure I've got the texture that I want. Using that food mill and pressing it through those fine holes of that plate has helped assure that I've got a silky smooth texture. Sometimes when you use a masher, again, the flavor is great, but you might find that there's little pieces of potato. It's really hard to get it quite as smooth a puree if you use just a regular potato masher. So it looks like all of the butter is incorporated now. I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit of salt and pepper. I did have some salt in that cooking water, of course, but most of that ends up going away when you drain the potatoes, of course. So I'm adding some salt, a little bit of ground pepper. If you've got white pepper on hand, you may want to use that. Some folks prefer to use white pepper in potato dishes just because it's a little bit less visible later in the finished dish, but I usually don't mind. I use black pepper all the time. I think that's it. So you can see that beautiful, silky, smooth texture, rich with butter and cream. This is a really straightforward, simple recipe, a beautiful, luxurious pum puree or potato puree. There are a lot of ways that you can be creative from this point and vary this recipe. It can just be done so many different ways. One would be simply to stir in some freshly chopped herbs at this point. Maybe some chives, chervil, flat leaf parsley would be great. You could use half as many potatoes and exchange the rest of the potatoes for some celery root or turnips perhaps, or rutabaga. Other similar sort of root-like vegetables contribute another level of flavor and add some really delightful character to a puree of this kind. The same's true of the gratin that we did earlier. There's a lot of ways that you can make variations there too. One is one that everybody loves, of course, potatoes and cheese together. You could add some grated Gruyere or Parmesan cheese to the different layers with that thyme. You can also add, if you want to go even more decadent, add some little slivered pieces of cooked bacon between the layers. And again, you could use other root vegetables, some celery root, other vegetables that you thinly slice and add to the gratin with the potato. A lot of ways you can go. So both of these are awesome base foundation recipes with lots of room for creativity. And for our next lesson, we're finally going to get to dessert. It's going to be a French vanilla custard ice cream. So we're going to learn how to make a custard base. We're going to learn some tips for working with vanilla beans, and I'm also going to give you some insider tips on making the best ice cream in general, how to make it work. See you soon. Welcome back. This is French Home Cooking, The Essential Techniques. I'm Cynthia Nims. In this lesson, we finally get to everybody's favorite course, dessert. We're going to explore the delicious French custard ice cream. And there's a few really important techniques you're going to learn in this lesson. One is the simple base of an ice cream, French style, which is a crème anglaise or a custard sauce. Next, we're going to learn how to work with vanilla beans. And lastly, I'm going to give you some tips to make sure you get the best results when it comes to churning and freezing your ice cream. Speaking of that vanilla bean, I'm going to get right to talking to you a little bit about this. This is a classic, simple vanilla ice cream, and you really get the best vanilla flavor if you're able to work from a whole bean. You can buy these usually one or two at a time at the grocery store. Look for them in sort of the spice department or specialty food shops. To extract the most flavor out of the vanilla bean, what you want to do first is split it lengthwise, which exposes the tender, delicate seeds inside that have even more flavor. So just set the bean on the work surface and use the tip of a small knife, insert it to one end of the bean, and simply, carefully run it down the length. And split it in half. And when you see it up close, I'm not sure if you can see it on the screen, but when you split the bean at home, you'll see that there are a lot of tiny, delicate little black seeds inside. And each of those contains a lot of flavor, and eventually they're going to be distributed into the cream base, the custard base, and we'll see these lovely little flecks of flavor in the finished dish. So what I'm going to do first to start this custard is warm the milk and cream before I mix them with the eggs and sugar in a little bit. So I'm going to start by putting in some whole milk. and just half of the cream that I'm going to be using. This is going to be about 1 cup of heavy cream. The rest of this I'm going to chill, and it gets added to the custard sauce later. I'm going to put this on a low, sort of a medium heat to start. I'm going to add both of the halves of the vanilla bean directly to the pan. The fun thing about vanilla over the years, in the recent years, we're seeing more and more types of vanilla. Well, I guess it's all the same type of vanilla, but vanilla from different regions of the world where they have slight flavor variations. Some are more intense, some are sweeter, some are a little more savory. You'll see vanilla beans from Tahiti and Madagascar and Mexico. So it's kind of fun to play around with different types of vanilla. When you see them at the store, you might see that you have even some different choices to pick from. So I'm really going to just let this cream mixture come to a very low boil. And as soon as it hits the boil, I really don't want to simmer it. It's just going to infuse, which means that it's just going to gently absorb those vanilla flavors for about 10 or 15 minutes. As soon as it comes to a boil, I actually just turn the heat off, put the lid on, and let it sit quietly to absorb those flavors before we continue to make the custard sauce. So when we come back in a moment, I will have my egg yolks and sugar, and we'll get to actually making the custard base. So it's been about 15 minutes or so that the vanilla bean halves have been infusing in this milk and cream mixture. It's ready to go ahead and continue now with the custard. But first I'm going to go ahead and lift those vanilla beans out. Ooh, isn't that nice? You can see that the vanilla seeds have already started to sort of run off into the cream. That's awesome. And this is a time when I like to go ahead and take the vanilla bean halves out before we continue. And what I like to do, again, I mentioned earlier that there's all these tiny seeds that pack so much flavor. So what I like to do before going on is actually running my finger down the length of the seed, and you'll see these black seeds, down the length of the whole bean pod, and then these seeds come off. They're all soft now, and then I just put them back into the ice cream. They're going to be even more delicious then. So I know I've got 2 halves in here. I'm pretty sure I still do. There's the other one. Again, just running my thumb and finger down the length to get out a maximum of those lovely little vanilla seeds that have all that flavor. Now these vanilla bean pods that are left, they actually still have some flavor. We've gotten a decent amount out here in this infusion of 10 or 15 minutes, but there's still some flavor left in here, and you could use this again for another custard. These are great to add to poaching liquid if you're poaching some fruits. There's a lot of ways you could reuse these. What I like to do is let them dry completely first, and you can either store them as is to use again as the vanilla bean pods, or what's a really great French technique. They use a lot of vanilla sugar in France in baking and cooking and all sorts of different desserts. And it's as simple as having a canister like this with sugar in it, with a nice seal on it. After these beans have dried, go ahead and just put them down in the sugar, sort of shove them down under the sugar, cover them with, make sure there's enough sugar in there to cover them, and let it sit in a dry, cool place for a good couple of weeks. And that vanilla is going to gently sort of infuse some flavor and aroma into the sugar. And what's nice is you can use some of the sugar, and then as you use it, just put more sugar back in the jar. And you can also just continue to add more vanilla beans. So it becomes, I've got one at home that I've been feeding and using and feeding more over the course of a couple of years. And it's really a great addition to cookies or using as the sugar for a creme brulee. And you get a little extra vanilla essence that way. It's lovely. Gets the most out of these beans too. They can be a little bit expensive. So what we do next then is move on to the custard. I've got my separated egg yolks. We start first by mixing the sugar and the egg yolks together. And you want to use a good wire whisk. Start a little bit gently. If you stir too drastically, too anxiously at the beginning, you can have sugar sort of fly all over the place. So take it easy to begin with. And then once it's blended, continue to blend for a little bit until you see that the color starts to lighten. You're making sure that that sugar and egg yolk is super well incorporated, and it's just going to help make a smoother custard that cooks really evenly and has a nice silky texture later. So you can see even just after 15 or 20 seconds, the color lightens a little bit. Sugar begins to dissolve some too. It just facilitates the rest of the custard process. I like to work around the side of the bowl too, make sure I don't have any lingering sugar up there that hasn't been blended in. Then the next thing we're going to be doing is adding this warm milk to, we're going to add a little bit of the warm milk to the egg yolk mixture. Ultimately, it's all going to go back in the pan. If I were just to add this egg yolk mixture directly to this hot milk, it's very likely that the egg yolks are going to curdle. They're going to essentially start cooking. So I temper it a little bit, making this pot or this bowl warmer, add a little bit of the heat here to here. So when this then goes back into the pot, they're more at a similar temperature and you're not as likely to have the egg yolks curdle. But I've got a little technique here to share with you because unless you have a spare hand or someone else who can hold the bowl for you, it can be a little awkward to be whisking because you do have to whisk constantly as you're adding the warm cream, and the bowl moves around a lot, so that's a little awkward. So you take a kitchen towel. I've dampened it a little bit, which just helps it sit securely. I roll it up into a long tube, wrap it around the bowl, and a tiny little little knot, and you'll see now the bowl sits still. So it's much easier to use both hands for the custard blending, and the bowl sits still, which is very, very helpful. So again, must be whisking constantly. We want to make sure this blends in evenly, just a little bit at a time. Again, you're trying to very slowly and gently warm up those egg yolks. See if I can do this without making a big, big mess. And once they've gotten pretty warm from part of that addition, you can just keep adding more. It's an important little step to remember to slowly add that cream at the beginning so that the egg yolks have a chance to very, very gently warm up. So now the pan goes back on the stove. Just make sure one more time that this is all well blended. And then I pour this just back into the pan. And this custard does need to cook a little bit longer to thicken up some. And then this is essentially going to be the base of our ice cream. Now it's time to switch to a wooden spoon for cooking the custard. The whisk is going to incorporate too much air. We really don't want a lot of air bubbles in the ice cream at this point to make the custard base. So medium heat, medium low. It's not a complicated recipe, but you do want to avoid overcooking the custard. I think that's one of the most important elements in making a custard sauce, is to avoid overcooking the egg yolks. So here we're cooking it gently. It's going to take maybe 5 to 7 minutes. You can see it's really liquidy right now. It runs very, very quickly off this spoon. And in about 5 or 6 minutes, we'll see that it's thickened lightly, and we'll be testing by sort of looking at the thickness and the coating consistency of the sauce on the back of the spoon. Be sure and stir pretty often. Don't go take a phone call or answer. If you have to answer the door, turn off the heat. You want to pay attention and make sure you're moving that custard around really evenly so things don't stick on the bottom. This happens to be a really awesome spoon for this because it's got that little pointed edge that helps get into the corners, because I think that's one of the areas where you're likely to have the biggest problems. The bottom is kind of easy to get at, but those corners can be where things start to stick and overcook. So we'll just keep at this gentle heat, and I'll check back with you in a few minutes and show you what the texture looks like when it's properly cooked. So you can see now that the custard has thickened quite a lot in the 7 or so minutes that it's been simmering. Even drawing the spoon around in the pan, you sort of see that it has a slightly thicker texture, and it's a little more opaque now. I'm going to go ahead and take it off the heat because there's nothing worse than leaving it on that minute too long. And I'm going to pour it directly into my clean bowl. Be sure you do clean it before you add the custard because it had raw egg yolk in it earlier. Nice, silky, luxurious texture. Check the bottom of the bowl, the bottom of the pan, and see if there happen to be any of those delicious little vanilla seeds still lingering. Looks like most of mine came out, but sometimes it's worth getting out a scraper and getting the last bits of those out. So the last thing I need to do here, well, let me start by saying basically what we have right here is a crème anglaise, or a custard sauce. A really great foundational recipe that actually can be used a number of ways as is. As I mentioned with the bechamel sauce earlier, depending on the use, you can make it thicker or thinner, however you like, and it's basically a matter of adding more or less of whatever the liquid is that you're using. So if this were made a little bit thicker, it could be a dipping sauce for fruit fritters. You could certainly pour it over a chocolate decadent cake of some kind. You can use it in any number of different dishes, in desserts. You could make a really decadent bread pudding by just adding some bread to this and baking it. It's really a great foundation. And then what I'm going to do here, the very last step, is adding that chilled cream, that little bit of chilled cream that we kept from the previous step of making the custard base. What that does is help chill down the custard just a little bit, and it also, of course, adds a little bit more richness. So the very, very important thing at this point before you proceed to make the ice cream is to make sure that this is fully chilled. This is very, very hot right now. Let it cool to room temperature, and then beyond that, it's even very, very important that this be fully chilled through. So I let it sit aside on the counter until it's room temperature, cover it with plastic wrap, and put it in the refrigerator, preferably overnight, at least 6 to 8 hours. You want it to be fully chilled. Every time I've tried to skip that step and only chill it for a few hours, it just doesn't churn as well. It really does need to be really cold before it goes into the ice cream churn later to make sure you get the silkiest, most delicious results. So I'm going to set this aside at room temp. If you're in a hurry, you might save a little bit of time by putting this in an ice bath to cool it down, but you're still going to need that 6 to 8 hours in the fridge, I promise. So we'll be back shortly with our chilled custard, and we'll proceed to make the ice cream. So I've got a chilled custard base that I made earlier. It's really cold and ready to go. I'm going to go ahead and get this rocking and rolling. Don't want to miss any of this delicious custard, so I'm going to go ahead and scrape out as much as I can. It doesn't look like a whole lot right now, but the volume is going to increase quite a lot as it churns and freezes. Those little bars in the churn are going to lighten up the ice cream. You'll see that it becomes really fluffy and delicious. This is a type of ice cream maker that I have at home, a different model, but mine also has this frozen core, which is something that if you have room in your freezer, it's delightful just to go ahead and keep it in the freezer and have it ready to go. Otherwise, you just need to plan ahead. If you don't have room in your freezer at all times, plan ahead, put it in the freezer at least 24 hours before you plan to make the ice cream. And I love a countertop model like this. This is similar to what I have at home. There are other models that are much larger, and some of them have their own internal freezing devices. It chills and churns at the same time. But I like this model. It doesn't take up much counter space. It can be stored away when not in use, and I just pull it out, 5, 6, 10 times a month, however often I need to make homemade ice cream, which I actually love to do. So I'm just going to let this sit. This particular model, this will take about 20 to 25 minutes to churn. Every brand or model of ice cream maker can be a little bit different, so just see what your instructions say. Usually 20 to 30 minutes is plenty of time. So we'll check back in. You'll see how much volume this has, how light and fluffy it becomes, and then we're going to have a chance to actually taste some delicious French custard ice cream. Because you always have to have some before you put it in the freezer. It's the law. So you can see what a difference that 25 minutes or so made. The volume of the ice cream's really developed. It's got a luscious, sort of silky, luxurious, rich texture. And this is plenty churned now. I'm going to go ahead and turn the machine off and transfer it to my ice cream container. Wow, it's a lot quieter now. So first, you're going to need to certainly take out the center workings. And you do want to work relatively quickly. It doesn't have to be insanely fast, but if you let this ice cream sit in that frozen core for too long before you get it out, it's just going to freeze and adhere to the edges. So you want to go ahead and work pretty quickly to move it into your freezer container. Pick something that is a resealable, freezer safe. Plastic is generally best, or I suppose there's other materials, but something that's definitely freezer safe and will have a good seal on it. So get as much as you can off of the center mechanism there. And just scoop out, look at all that delicious ice cream, and you can see the flecks of that wonderful vanilla seed. This is kind of that perfect soft serve ice cream texture. It's a little too soft, unless you've got a whole slew of folks handy that want to eat the whole batch right away. Well, that's probably possible, but usually when you're going to serve the ice cream, you want it to be a little bit firmer. So it is, again, sort of important to plan ahead and allow some time, a good hour or two, for the ice cream to freeze a little bit more, get a little bit more sturdy. And you do want to go ahead and get it into the freezer right away. You've worked so hard to get that churned and light and fluffy. Go ahead and get it in the freezer right away. And again, if you give it about an hour might be enough. You can obviously make ice cream well in advance, keep it for a few weeks if it lasts that long. So there we go. French custard ice cream, simple, elegant, delicious, and a great foundation for a whole slew of really elegant desserts. So thank you so much for joining me in this exploration of French home cooking through a whole array of building block techniques. I hope you're going to feel a little more comfortable now going into the kitchen and whipping up a souffle, making a beef stew, getting your own sort of creative juices going with those vinaigrette dressings that are so easy to change from one day to the next. I hope you found that there are a lot of building blocks here that you're going to be able to use not only for these recipes, but for a whole array of variations where you're going to be able to add your own personal touch when you go to the kitchen.